Chapter 586. After Elizabeth helped Emma bathe and cook some oatmeal for the little girl, who was still clamoring for food, she realized that Eric and Julia still hadn't come downstairs. Emma was lying on the coffee table in the living room, eating with a spoon. When she saw Elizabeth looking at the stairs from time to time, the little girl quickly thought of Eric. She raised her small face and asked, "Mommy, where's Daddy?" When Elizabeth heard Emma's words, she looked at the stairs again in a panic. When she saw that no one was coming out, she heaved a sigh of relief. She got up and left the sofa to kneel on the carpet beside the coffee table with Emma. Elizabeth patted the little girl's head and said gently, "Emma, let's play a game, okay?" When the little girl, who was no longer hungry, heard that, her eyes immediately lit up. She put down the spoon and said, "Okay. The game is like this. From now on, when we talk, you call me Liz and I'll call you Emma. Let's see who can last longer, okay?" Emma tilted her head and hesitated before shaking her head. "It's not fun." Elizabeth's tone was a little anxious. "Emma, if you don't want to play this game, then I won't take you to Disneyland anymore. Also, I won't take you to Coldwater Canyon Park anymore." Emma blinked her eyes and blurted out, "Auntie, take me there." Elizabeth inadvertently glanced at the little girl's empty bowl and said tentatively, "Then if Auntie doesn't give you anything to eat, I won't cook oatmeal for you either." This was a big threat. Emma immediately showed a worried look and quickly said, "Okay, let's play a game." Elizabeth sighed in relief and said, "Then let's try it first. What should you call me now?" "Liz," Emma shouted and picked up the small bowl in front of her. More. The little guy had just eaten some chocolate cake and a bowl of oatmeal. Elizabeth knew that she couldn't let the little guy eat anymore. She said softly, "Let's eat this much today, okay? We'll eat again tomorrow morning." Talking doesn't count. Hearing Elizabeth's rejection, Emma's expression immediately became aggrieved. A child's intuition seemed to be very strange. After complaining tearfully, the little one once again blurted out without anyone teaching her. She even deliberately raised her voice. "Mommy!" Elizabeth had almost hit the glass coffee table. She patted her forehead and sighed silently in her heart. She had no choice but to take the small bowl in the little guy's hand. "Here, you can only eat half a bowl, no more." "Yes." Emma immediately nodded vigorously. Looking at Elizabeth's expression, the little one felt that she should do something. Her beautiful blue eyes turned, and once again, she called out in a tender voice, "Liz." Elizabeth, who had just gotten up, heard the little guy flexibly switching between the two forms of address. She could not help but have a thought in her heart. Is this considered as being trapped in a trap of one's own making? After waking Julia up, Eric quickly figured out the whole story. The so-called child abuse tragedy obviously didn't happen. Julia had dinner with a few friends in the evening. She drank some wine and was a little tipsy. So when she got home, she suddenly had a whim or maternal instinct. In short, she suddenly wanted to take care of the little one herself. She sent the nanny to rest and played with Emma for a while. She felt that the little girl was a little sleepy, so she coaxed Emma to sleep and then went to rest. In the process, both Julia and the nanny neglected a problem. The little one had not eaten dinner yet. Julia did not ask, and the nanny did not say anything. Both of them thought that the other party would prepare food for the little one. And the little one did not say that she was hungry until she fell asleep. So, there was the scene that Eric and Elizabeth saw when they just entered the door. Emma was woken up by hunger in the middle of the night, and ran out of the baby room to look for food. Since Emma was adopted by Julia, Eric often saw the little one. 2 years ago, during the Los Angeles riots, Emma even lived with Julia at the Sharp Corner Manor for a period of time. Eric was very close to the little girl who had grown up from a little girl to the present. This was also the reason why he had never corrected the little one to call him Daddy. Although he was not fond of the customs of Western godfathers, Eric had already treated the little one as his goddaughter. Therefore, although he understood that Julia did not do it on purpose, Eric was still angry at this woman's carelessness. In addition, when he saw the movie that Julia filmed last year, the fire in Eric's heart rose even more. Last year, Eric had planned to let Julia star in another romantic comedy to restore her popularity that had fallen because she took care of Emma. But this woman took care of herself and accepted another movie contract. Well, if she accepted it, then so be it. Anyway, he had never thought of forcing his woman to only make movies for fireflies. Unexpectedly, Eric accidentally discovered that the movie was a mess. 2 reporters rushed to Las Vegas to investigate the criminal evidence of a casino tycoon. And then there was no more and then. Julia, who played the female reporter, did not even leave the hotel room for the entire movie. The plot was even more ridiculous. The whole movie was like a primary school student's 10-minute homework to deal with the teacher's inspection. When this movie was released, the critics were all scolding it. The little remaining popularity that it had accumulated from movies such as Pretty Woman and Steel Magnolias had completely dissipated. She's degenerating and ruining her own future. Lazy woman, how can she not strive to improve? The more he thought about it, the angrier Eric became. Thus he taught Julia a lesson. He only stopped when he realized that although this woman was begging for mercy, she looked like she was enjoying the punishment. After feeding the little guy and putting him on the sofa to watch cartoons, Elizabeth looked at the stairs again. She had lost count of how many times she had done so. She felt a little sour in her heart. It's been so long, and they still haven't come down. The 2 of them must be getting ridiculous, but I have to stay here to watch the child. How hateful. This time, I definitely won't take the initiative to send myself to him. Absolutely not. With that in mind, Elizabeth finally heard the sound of footsteps coming from the stairs. She quickly hid her expression and put on a cold look. Eric and Julia walked downstairs one after another. Elizabeth ignored Eric and glared at Julia, who was still blushing behind Eric. Humph, cheating couple. Eric sat down on the sofa, but Julia walked to the coffee machine in the corner of the living room. When Elizabeth saw Julia's proactive behavior, she felt a sense of disappointment in her heart. She was about to release her anger to Eric, but her gaze couldn't help but fall on Eric's waist. The Hermes belt that she gave Eric as a Christmas gift was missing. Oh, I left it upstairs, Eric explained casually. Humph. Elizabeth squeezed out a syllable as if to say that she didn't care. Julia quickly brewed the coffee and poured a cup for Eric. She handed it over with ice cubes. Eric picked up the cup and blew on it. He took a sip and pointed to the sofa next to him. Sit down, I have something to discuss with you. Julia nodded gently and leaned over to the sofa. However, just as she touched the surface of the sofa, she stood up. Elizabeth saw Julia's pitiful expression as she reached out to cover her back. She turned to Eric and said hatefully, "Violent maniac." However, the girl's tone didn't sound like she was complaining at all. It was more like she was blaming Eric for not being violent. When Eric heard Elizabeth say this, he glanced at her with interest. Elizabeth immediately avoided Eric's gaze guiltily. She also realized that her tone wasn't fierce enough. Instead, it was more like, how is that possible? I'm not a masochist. Absolutely yes, no, I'm not. In order to prove that she wasn't guilty, Elizabeth thought for a while and quickly turned her head. However, she found that Eric had already turned to Julia, who was sitting crookedly on the sofa. How much money do you have now? Eric looked at Julia and asked. Julia shook her head and hesitated for a moment before saying, probably maybe 30 million. Eric was a little helpless. This woman doesn't even know how much money she has. Contact your accountant tomorrow to calculate. Leave behind $100,000 for living expenses. Leave the rest to me. Julia, don't give it to him. This is robbery. Elizabeth was immediately dissatisfied. Julia nodded obediently as if she didn't hear Elizabeth's words. And I understand. Eric ignored Elizabeth and continued. When Firefly completes the acquisition of the television network, I will exchange your money for Firefly shares. However, these shares and the subsequent dividends will be kept by me for you. When you win the Oscar for Best Actress, the right to dispose of these shares will be transferred to you. Elizabeth, who was about to say something, suddenly stopped in surprise when she heard Eric's words. She looked at Julia with faint envy in her eyes. After Firefly Pictures announced its annual financial report, countless investment institutions wanted to invest in Firefly. They were even willing to offer several times the premium, but they were all firmly rejected by Eric. Even in this acquisition of the television network, Eric did not intend to share too much of his shares. However, this time he took the initiative to exchange Julia's cash for Firefly shares. Although this amount of money was insignificant to the future merger of Firefly, it was enough to show that Eric completely treated Julia as his woman. Although Julia had a certain syndrome by accident, there was no problem with her IQ. She also realized the purpose of Eric's actions. If it were any other time, Julia might have been a little worried that Eric would completely tie her to him. However, after being taught a lesson by Eric, Julia did not have any thoughts of resistance in her heart. Instead, her mind was filled with obedience and dependence. At this time, Julia would probably not hesitate for too long if Eric ordered her to jump off a nearby cliff. Eric saw that Julia not only did not bargain with him, but also agreed obediently. He couldn't help but feel a trace of guilt in his heart. However, since the facts could not be changed, it was best to let it develop in a better direction. Lowering his head and sipping a few mouthfuls of coffee, Eric glanced at Elizabeth and Julia beside him, as well as the little one who was watching cartoons attentively. He said, "Liz will definitely be very busy after becoming the vice president of Fox. You can't always be idle. This time, I will personally arrange your next film. Don't be lazy anymore. So, it's not suitable for Emma to stay here. The environment in Hollywood is not good for Emma's growth. I plan to send Emma to New York to be with the two little ones. I'll let Joan take care of her. Do you have any objections?" Although there were no accidents tonight, the two women also knew that Eric's suggestion was necessary. They couldn't wait for something to happen before they regretted it. Seeing Julia nod, Elizabeth asked with some concern, "What about Julia's brother and sister? Also, will Joan accept Emma?" Since the custody is on Julia's side, they have no reason to interfere, Eric said. Also, Joan likes children very much. When Vicky went out to film, she was the one who took care of Kevin. It's not a big deal to add Emma. Since you have agreed, I'll call Joan tomorrow to discuss this matter. The little one is already 3 years old. It's time for her to go to kindergarten. By the time they finished discussing these matters, it was almost dawn. Julia carried the sleepy Emma to the baby's room. Eric continued to drink the coffee in his cup. Looking at Elizabeth, who seemed to be a little absent-minded, he once again revealed a faint smirk. He stood up and said, "Let's go. I'll show you something good." "What good?" Elizabeth subconsciously stood up as well. "The belt you gave me. I suddenly found that it has a lot of uses. Let's study it again. You can be my assistant." Elizabeth was stunned for half a second before she reacted. She felt Eric holding her hand and leading her to the stairs. For some reason, her body trembled slightly. She weakly followed Eric upstairs, but her mouth kept resisting. I don't want to. You let go." The February morning in Los Angeles was still a little chilly, but Eric enjoyed the feeling of sitting in the mansion's courtyard at the top of Beverly Hills. Whether it was downtown Los Angeles in the south or the valley in the north, it was shrouded in a thin layer of fog, but Eric could feel the faint warmth of the rising sun. Elizabeth and Julia had specially placed a few sets of viewing seats in the courtyard of the mountaintop mansion. Eric was sitting at a round table with an IBM laptop on the table. Beside him was today's Los Angeles Times. Although it was only 8 o'clock in Los Angeles, it was already 11 o'clock in New York. Eric had just talked to Katzenberg over the phone about the negotiation process with ABC in the morning. Although the media all over the world was paying attention to this matter, and Eric's newspaper had a large number of articles reporting on the movements of both sides, contacting the parties involved in the negotiation would undoubtedly allow him to obtain more accurate first-hand information. Moreover, there were some problems with the negotiation in New York this morning. Chapter 587. Elizabeth and Julia walked out of the villa with breakfast together, and came to the round table, just in time to see Eric frowning slightly. Putting a breakfast in Eric's hand, Elizabeth asked softly, "What's wrong?" Eric pressed the newspaper under the laptop to make room, took a sip of warm milk, and said, "There's a small situation in the acquisition negotiations in New York." She knew that she shouldn't continue to ask about the acquisition negotiations of ABC television network. Although Elizabeth didn't have any other thoughts in her mind, even if she knew something from Eric, she would never talk about it. But she knew very well that her old man wanted Eric's plan to acquire the other 3 television networks to fail. This way, the Firefly television department was very likely to continue to cooperate with Fox, so Elizabeth felt that it was necessary to avoid arousing suspicion. However, Julia didn't know Elizabeth's thoughts, and she didn't have such scruples. She sat down next to Eric and asked curiously, "What happened?" ABC is worried that Firefly's debt will be too high after the acquisition, which will increase the company's burden. They asked Firefly to reduce the proportion of bonds issued and raise acquisition funds by going public. Elizabeth, who was listening quietly, raised her eyebrows slightly. Although she didn't know the details of Firefly's acquisition plan, she also knew that if Firefly successfully completed the acquisition of ABC television network, its market value would easily exceed US $30 billion, but its long-term debt might only be about $10 billion. After conversion, the debt ratio was only 30%. Such a debt ratio was not high for any large company, and it could even have a very good tax avoidance effect. ABC's request was definitely not out of concern about Firefly's debt burden, but more likely to weaken Eric's control over Firefly as much as possible after the merger. Although Elizabeth immediately understood ABC's intentions, Julia obviously didn't understand some of the financial terms Eric said. However, Julia also easily found her interest and asked, "How much debt will you owe after you acquire ABC?" Plus the previous debt accumulation, about $10 billion US dollars. Julia smacked her lips in surprise and said, "So much. If that's the case, I also think going public is better." Eric smiled and shook his head, not saying anything. Elizabeth said, "Julia, it's not like that. After the acquisition, according to the market value of the new Firefly that may exceed $30 billion US dollars in the future, $10 billion US dollars is only equivalent to 30% of the debt. Many large companies have debt ratios much higher than 30%. The ultimate goal of ABC is to get Firefly listed, not to reduce the debt." I don't really understand, but even if this $10 billion US dollars is paid over 10 years, there will probably be interest. According to Firefly's profit this year, even if we add ABC's, doesn't that mean? Julia couldn't help but stick out her tongue as she spoke. She also realized that this was obviously impossible. Otherwise, how could a company with a higher debt ratio than Firefly make money like what Elizabeth said? Of course not. Elizabeth didn't mind Julia's ignorance. Instead, she analyzed with relish. According to the debt of $10 billion US dollars with an annual interest of 5%, the principal and interest of Firefly Pictures in the first year may be $1.5 billion US dollars. Of course, as the debt ratio decreases, this number will become smaller and smaller. Based on the calculation of $1.5 billion US dollars in the first year, this money is not calculated from the net profit, but from the company's revenue as the company's operating costs. Just like this year, although the total net profit of Firefly and ABC is only $1.5 billion US dollars, the total operating income of the two companies is close to $20 billion US dollars. Moreover, this $1.5 billion US dollars can also serve as a tax shelter. According to the corporate income tax of about 35% in North America, $525 million US dollars of the $1.5 billion US dollars originally belonged to the IRS. Firefly itself is equivalent to using less than $1 billion US dollars to pay off the debt. At the end, Elizabeth smiled and looked at Eric, somewhat gloating. Of course, with such a high debt, if Firefly's performance can't continue to grow rapidly in the future, even if it just stagnates, you will definitely be in trouble. Julia didn't understand much of Elizabeth's fast speech mixed with a series of numerical analysis. Instead, when she heard the last sentence, she looked at Eric with some worry. "It's okay. If I go bankrupt in the future, I can still live off a woman," Eric said with a smile and reached out to touch Julia's worried face. Elizabeth looked at Julia, subconsciously squinting her eyes and pressing her face against Eric's palm. She made a disgusted expression and waved her small hand as if she was shooing flies away. "I really can't stand you guys." After breakfast, while Lisabeth hurriedly drove to Century City to work. Julia followed Eric's instructions last night and took Emma to her accountant. After breakfast, Eric called Katzenberg to talk about some things before opening his email. Ever since he had Hotmail, Alan often didn't have to personally deliver documents to Eric. Many things could be solved through email. The people around Eric gradually got used to contacting him through email. After reading the emails that had accumulated yesterday, it was already past 9 o'clock. Eric packed up his laptop and put it back in Lisabeth's room. Just as he was about to go to the girls' garage to find a car to go to Praia Vista, his mobile phone rang. The call was from Amy Pascal. The two chatted on the phone for a while before Eric hung up. An hour later, Eric drove a somewhat clumsy white Chevrolet business car to a seafood restaurant in Venice Beach. Amy Pascal and Drew were already waiting there. Drew rushed over and hugged Eric. When she saw Eric's Chevrolet parked in the parking lot, she subconsciously complained, "When did you buy this car? You have such bad taste." However, as soon as she said that, she realized that it might be a woman's car. She pursed her lips and waited for Eric to finish greeting Amy Pascal. She then pulled him into the restaurant. It was still early for lunch. Perhaps they had already been ordered to sit down at the table. The waiter just served Eric a cup of coffee and walked away quietly. Eric wasn't in the mood to drink coffee. He pushed the coffee cup to the side and asked, "How many did you bring back?" Amy Pascal took out a folder from her bag and handed it to him. She said, "3. The copyright owners of Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, and Hulk have all agreed to the transfer agreement. 21st Century Pictures, which owns Captain America, insists on 30% of the investment rights for Night at the Museum, and the same proportion for the subsequent sequels. They have never been willing to give in. So it's up to you to decide whether to agree or not. However, Eric, I don't recommend agreeing. Otherwise, although you have already got the copyright, the other 3 companies will definitely be very dissatisfied. They will only get 20% of the investment rights and 10% of the sequels. Oh, by the way, they all chose the special effects movie Night at the Museum." Eric listened to Amy's explanation and looked down at the copyright transfer agreement in his hand. In addition to Spider-Man, although the other 2 were first-tier Marvel superheroes, their adaptations in the original time and space were not very successful. However, as long as Spider-Man was in his hands. When he watched the Avengers series in the original time and space, Eric didn't like Captain America the most. If he really couldn't get it back in the future, then he would let Captain America hide in the Avengers. Eric also didn't believe that 21st Century Pictures could play any tricks without the cooperation of other superheroes. When Marvel Pictures got the copyright in the future, the copyright of Captain America would automatically return sooner or later. Eric didn't know much about the superhero system. After reading the 3 transfer agreements in his hand, he asked, "Is there anything else?" Amy Pascal looked at Eric and smiled. "There's a Blade Warrior that was bought by New Line a few years ago. It just expires at the end of this year. If Firefly wants to continue to maintain the copyright, they either have to negotiate with Marvel Pictures to renew the contract or shoot the movie. Other than that, there's almost nothing else. By the way, when I was investigating, I found that Marvel Comics is negotiating with Universal about the transfer of the copyright of X-Men." After the 7 chief writers of Marvel Comics left together last year, Marvel's situation this year is even worse, so they are eager to sell some of the copyright to get operating funds. The other companies were fine, but it had to be Universal. Eric had a headache. With Michael Eisner's shrewdness, once they made a move, Universal would definitely increase the chips. If they wanted to snatch it again, it would not be so easy unless they were a sucker and quoted a high price. Amy seemed to see through Eric's eyes. She smiled and said, "Eric, it's not that difficult to get the copyright of X-Men. Don't you know? Michael Eisner has been in a physical condition recently, and it may even be life-threatening. He has been contacting Michael Eisner for a heart surgery. Most of Universal's affairs are now managed by Michael Eisner's deputy. I heard that Michael Eisner also wants his good friend Michael Ovitz to be the president of Universal." Eric remembered that in the original space-time, Michael Eisner did have a major physical condition in 1994. Eric did not know the details. He only knew that before the operation, Michael Eisner seemed to have the mentality that he might die on the operating table, and designated the successor of Disney. If you can snatch it, then try to snatch it. Of course, don't make too much noise. I understand, Amy nodded and said. What Marvel needs most now is funds, so as long as we offer a high enough price, Marvel will definitely choose us. Speaking of this, Amy suddenly said, by the way, Eric, I think if you are optimistic about the superheroes of Marvel Comics, why don't you buy all of Marvel Comics now? With Marvel's current situation, maybe you don't even need $200 million to buy it. Eric shook his head gently and said with a smile, now is not the time. In short, you just have to snatch the copyright of X-Men. Amy Pascal did not understand what Eric meant, but she did not ask much. She nodded and said, then since we already have Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, and Hulk, when do you plan to start these projects? Save it first, Eric said. Wait for the special effects technology to develop for a few more years. If I make it now, it will definitely not achieve the effect I want. Even if it achieves it, the production cost is estimated to be sky-high. Amy nodded. When she exchanged the copyrights of these superheroes, she had already realized this problem. Compared to DC's Superman and Batman, Marvel's superheroes' abilities were definitely cheating. Therefore, it was definitely much more difficult to show these superpowers one by one in a movie than DC's superheroes. Now was indeed not the time to develop a superhero movie. After discussing this matter, Amy discussed the official purpose of calling Eric. Kevin Costner and his agent will come over at 12 o'clock sharp. Eric, take a look at this script first. Amy said as she took out a script from her bag and handed it to Eric. Eric just glanced at the title of the script, and his eyes narrowed slightly. The inertia of history is really super powerful. A few words were written conspicuously on the first page of the script. Future Waterworld. The culprit behind the decline of Kevin Costner's career. After the disastrous failure of Future Waterworld, Kevin Costner, who was originally on par with Tom Cruise and Mel Gibson, could not recover from the setback. While Tom Cruise was still supporting his fame in the Mission Impossible series, as a former Oscar winner for Best Director and Best Actor, Kevin Costner could only fall to the level of playing a supporting role as Superman's father in Superman, Man of Steel. When we invited Kevin Costner to act in Mission Impossible, Kevin Costner was preparing for this movie. After I read the script, I think it's very good and Kevin Costner hasn't reached an agreement with other movie companies. So I think, Eric, why don't you take this movie? I think it will become another Crazy Mike Ross. Amy's tone seemed a little excited, but she quickly stopped talking and smiled. Well, Eric, you should take a look at the script first. We'll talk later. Chapter 588. Future Waterworld was similar to Crazy Mike Cruise on the water. It was also a wasteland world after the collapse of civilization, except that one was set after a nuclear war with depleted resources, and the other was set in the distant future where the land was submerged by the sea. Compared to Throat Island, which had a huge investment but ended up being a box office dud, Future Waterworld was not too much of a failure with a global box office of more than $200 million. However, the production of this film was similar to Titanic. Because of a series of over-budget situations during the shooting process, the investors had no choice but to continue to inject funds into the crew in order to avoid the early investment going down the drain. Future Waterworld ended up costing $175 million, and with the publicity fee, the total investment was more than $200 million. It was the most expensive film before Titanic. However, the outcomes of the two films were worlds apart. Titanic created an unprecedented box office record, while Future Waterworld had a global box office of more than $200 million, but relative to the investment, it still caused a huge loss to the producers. From a bystander's point of view, Eric still liked the story setting of Future Waterworld very much. If the film could take the low-cost route of Crazy Mike Cruise, Eric would definitely not hesitate to take the project. But now that he was the boss of Firefly Pictures, Eric would never touch the project if he could foresee the future prospects of the film. Moreover, with Kevin Costner already intending to star in the Mission Impossible series before future Waterworld, Eric hoped that future Waterworld could repeat the same mistakes so that they could take the initiative in the salary negotiations for the Mission Impossible sequels. Both Amy and Drew could clearly feel that Eric was a little absent-minded when reading the script of future Waterworld. Drew knew that this often happened when Eric was reading the script, but it would not affect his judgment of a script. Amy Pascal, on the other hand, thought that Eric's absent-mindedness might be because he was not very optimistic about the film. Sure enough, Eric quickly flipped through the script. His expression did not have the slightest excitement when he saw a good script. He said to Amy, "Have you talked to Kevin Costner about this project?" Amy shook her head and said, "Not yet. When I was negotiating with Kevin Costner about Mission Impossible, I heard that Kevin Costner's production company was in contact with this project. Kevin Costner's agency WMA plans to package the project and sell it to a big studio." Eric frowned slightly when he heard the word package. Although CAA, WMA, and ICM were the three major agencies in Hollywood, because of the article he published, the other two agencies imitated CAA's package strategy. 3 years ago, Captain Hawk, which greatly damaged Spielberg's godhood as a director, was CAA's package project. When Eric first entered Hollywood a few years ago, he only felt from his memory that the agency's package strategy made the power of the agents too inflated, and at the same time, it made the stars' salaries and film production costs higher and higher. As he spent more time in Hollywood, Eric also had a deeper understanding of the agency's package strategy. The harm caused by the agency's package strategy to the film company was far more than that. The main creative staff of the package project film crew were recommended by the agency. Although they could be flexible, there was often not much room for choice. This also caused the main creative staff of a film project to be not suitable for the film, which ultimately led to the film's failure. Spielberg's Captain Hawk was the most classic example. The failure of a huge investment was the greatest damage to the film company. As the scale of the film investment increased, the impact of this damage became more and more serious. Just like the future Waterworld in his hands, if he wanted to shoot this wasteland-style film, there was no doubt that the most suitable director was George Miller, who became famous with the Crazy Mike Ross series. The future Waterworld, in the original space-time, was a complete imitation of Crazy Mike Ross, from the costumes to the setting. And as a result, it only imitated the outer shell. In Eric's memory, the director of this film was Kevin Reynolds, and the film was delayed to the end. Kevin Reynolds was unable to control the situation, and with a premonition that future Waterworld might be finished, he directly quit. It could be imagined that if the right director was chosen in the beginning, the ending of future Waterworld would certainly not be so bleak. Since it's a packaged project, let's not participate. Flowers Pictures can't have any failures now. Eric handed the script to Amy and said, "Let's pretend this never happened and concentrate on preparing for Mission Impossible." When Amy heard the word failure, she raised her eyebrows slightly, thinking that Eric was indeed not optimistic about this project. However, she also quickly realized the other meaning in Eric's words, and showed an understanding smile. If future Waterworld failed, it would certainly save a lot of money for the sequel of Mission Impossible. Looking at the time, it was almost 12 o'clock, and Kevin Costner would be coming soon. Amy hurriedly stuffed the script of future Waterworld into her bag. Kevin Costner quickly came to the restaurant with his agent. Although he knew that Eric was behind the Dances with Wolves incident, the matter had faded after a few years. After all, Hollywood was a gamble. Everyone had to accept their loss after making a bet. If one was brooding over the success or failure of a bet, it would be impossible to survive in Hollywood. Both parties used lunch to finalize the various details of Mission Impossible. Although they had some doubts about Eric's recommendation of Brian De Palma, the director of the horror film, the people sitting there were not stupid enough to doubt Eric's vision. Taking into account Kevin Costner's age, Eric only intended to make 3 installments of Mission Impossible in this spacetime. After all, after 3 installments, unless Kevin Costner took the initiative to reduce his pay, with the increase in the pay of the lead actors in Hollywood movies, It would be equivalent to the film company working for the stars if they continued to do so. However, as long as the copyright of the Mission Impossible series was in hand, after the trilogy, it could be shelved for 8 to 10 years. When Kevin Costner's influence on the series faded, the project could still be restarted again. At the same time, they could also play the sentimental card or something. Because Kevin Costner was anxious to start the production of future Waterworld. His schedule was very tight. After finalizing a series of main creators, Mission Impossible quickly entered the production stage, and Columbia also confirmed that the Mission Impossible series would be released at the end of the year. After making arrangements for Mission Impossible, Eric focused most of his energy on a series of movies that were about to be produced and entered the post-production stage while paying attention to the acquisition negotiations of ABC. Among the 3 movies in the summer, The Lion King had been completed, and the other 2 movies, Catherine Bigelow's Saving Private Ryan and Cameron's True Lies, were in the final editing stage. Eric was very confident in Cameron, so he did not interfere too much with True Lies. Before Saving Private Ryan wrapped up, Eric had already seen a lot of Catherine's footage and was very satisfied. The most important part was that the landing of Normandy, supported by the top special effects technology in the digital field, was even more shocking than the original version. However, Catherine's directing style was very different from the original version, so Eric had to often appear in the editing room, which caused Catherine to complain from time to time. The woman was not angry because of Eric's interference in the editing, but more because of Eric's distrust. Occasionally, there would be some small resentment in her tone that she did not realize. These were all the movies that were about to be released by Firefly. Eric also had to pay attention to the preparations for Jurassic Park 2 and Day of Independence. These 2 movies were expected to start shooting in the second half of the year. Because Eric did not plan to continue directing the Jurassic Park series, it took a lot of effort to choose a director. In addition to Firefly's own movies, Men in Black, which was a collaboration with Columbia, was also in the final stage and was scheduled for the summer vacation. Another movie, Game of the Brave, was scheduled for the end of the year because of the large amount of special effects work. DreamWorks' Break-In Doll was almost done with its final production. DreamWorks planned to start 3 movies this year, so that they could complete the plan of 10 movies in 3 years. Therefore, Eric had to spare enough energy for that side. He took the time to select 2 other works and wrote the outline of Resident Evil for the scriptwriters to complete the script. At the same time, he also came up with ideas for MGM's upcoming sequel to James Bond. Since Sophie had gone to Ireland with the Braveheart crew, Eric came up with the idea for James Bond, The GoldenEye, in the normal order. However, Famke Janssen had to film The X-Files during the filming of The GoldenEye, so Eric did not give her the role of the villain. In the midst of all these trivial matters, it was soon March. This year's Oscars were scheduled for March 21st, much earlier than in previous years. However, at the beginning of March, the most important thing in Hollywood was not the upcoming Oscars. Everyone was attracted by something else. Last night, because of Independence Day, he chatted with Roland Emmerich until late into the night. In addition, he had been busy recently. Eric had planned to sleep in today, but at 8 o'clock, Eric was woken up by Elizabeth, who rushed into his bedroom. Eric, wake up quickly. Look at this issue of Forbes magazine and the newspapers. Elizabeth's tone was a little hurried and excited. Eric woke up in a daze and reached out to hug the girl in front of him. Don't disturb me. I'll sleep a little longer. You're the richest man in the Federation now. Why are you still sleeping? Elizabeth hit Eric a few times. When Eric heard about Forbes, he knew what had happened. Regarding the latest issue of the Forbes Rich List, Eric and Steve Forbes had discussed several times over the phone, and finally settled on a number. Although this time, it was still not Eric's true net worth, it was the most beneficial for Firefly Pictures' negotiation of the acquisition of ABC television network. 19.7 billion. I didn't expect you to have so much money. You're a whole 10 billion more than the second place, Warren Buffett. Elizabeth saw that Eric was lazing in bed and had no choice but to lie down next to him and say, "You believe the numbers on this?" Eric turned his body and said. Elizabeth was stunned and said, "What do you mean?" Eric said, This number was discussed by Steve Forbes and I, so it's not accurate. Don't make a fuss about it. Help me make breakfast. Breakfast is ready, Elizabeth said and pushed Eric hard. Then tell me, how much money do you have? Eric knew that he could not continue sleeping. He opened his eyes and took the Forbes magazine in front of Elizabeth. He looked at it and said, "Look, didn't it say that because of the explosion of the film and television industry, out of the 19.7 billion in assets, 1.9 billion belongs to Firefly Pictures? Only 700 million is in other assets. If it's really that much, do you think Chris still has the ability to make a hostile takeover of LTD?" Elizabeth had heard about Chris' acquisition of LTD in New York. If Firefly Investments were to attract funds from the public, it would definitely have to set up an independent board of directors to supervise it. According to federal law, investment companies had to be regulated even if they were not listed. However, Firefly Investments had never done so. This meant that most of the money in Firefly Investments should be Eric's. Chris had offered more than $2 billion in New York to acquire LTD. Even if this was a leveraged buyout, without enough funds, Chris would definitely not dare to do this. Hearing Eric's words, Elizabeth was interested. She asked with great interest, "Then tell me, how much money do you have?" Eric usually preferred to keep a low profile, but as a man, he also wanted to show off his strength to the women around him. When he heard Elizabeth's question, Eric said, "Let's not talk about whether the valuation of Firefly Pictures is accurate or not. Anyway, I personally think that Firefly Pictures is definitely worth more than $20 billion US. As for Firefly Investments, I now indirectly hold shares through several private funds. I hold about 23% of Cisco's shares. You should know Cisco, right?" Elizabeth nodded in surprise. With Cisco's current market value, 23% of the shares were worth about $3 billion US. In addition, there's Yahoo, Hotmail, and IE, Eric continued. These three companies have attracted a lot of attention. The most recent offer was $500 million US. Chapter 589. Eric looked at Elizabeth's increasingly surprised expression and continued to count with a smile. 2 years ago, when the federal internet business was just emerging, I used $60 million US to invest in an internet service provider called AOL and got 30% of the shares. At that time, the federal internet users were only a little more than 1 million, and AOL's market share was only 10%. But after the explosive growth in the past 2 years, the size of the internet users in North America has increased tenfold. In the recent business report of AOL, its internet service market share has risen to about 20%, and the valuation given by Wall Street is $1.8 billion US. Elizabeth mentally calculated the results of Eric's $60 million US investment, and finally felt that she had found a flaw. She interrupted him and said, "That's impossible. A 900% return on investment in 2 years. Do you think I'll believe it?" "Haven't you noticed yet?" Eric pinched Elizabeth's unconvinced face and said, "A new high-tech industry is rapidly rising. Just like operating system software and personal computers in the 1980s created a large number of billionaires such as Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, the rise of the internet industry in the next few years will once again create a large number of corporate giants and billionaires. In this period of industrial explosion, a 900% return on investment in 2 years is not surprising at all." At this point, Eric suddenly remembered the classic line in Big Shot. He unconsciously smiled and said, "Moreover, I feel that the potential of the information industry is far from fully exploding. Maybe in a few years, if you invest $1 million US in it, it will become 10 million in the blink of an eye." Elizabeth had been in contact with the internet under Eric's influence, but she did not care much about the meaning behind these new things. After Eric pointed it out and connected it to some of the changes in life and work brought about by the internet in the past 2 years, she began to agree with Eric's words. "Other than that, I also bought a mobile phone company in Europe and Firefly Software, which was spun off from Firefly Pictures. Both companies are doing very well and are worth a total of $1.5 billion US without a problem. If Chris completes the acquisition of LTD, my interest in it will not be less than 40%. Let's call it 800 million. Eric thought for a moment and smiled. Outside of Hollywood, my wealth is close to 7 billion US dollars. It seems that I have 1 billion more than your family's assets. Elizabeth stared at Eric's somewhat detestable smile for a few seconds before she moved away guiltily. She raised her small fist and punched Eric's body powerlessly before she said in a seemingly angry and resentful tone, "Let's see how you're going to spend this much money." Eric looked at Elizabeth's originally pale face turning red. He leaned over and pressed the girl under his body. He easily caught her restless little hands and whispered in her ear, "Why don't you help me come up with an idea?" Elizabeth tilted her head weakly and snorted softly, And what does it have to do with me?" Just as they were about to continue being affectionate, the mobile phone that Eric placed on the dresser beside the bed rang at an untimely moment. The two had to separate slightly. Their happy moment was interrupted. Elizabeth was a little depressed as she reached out and pinched Eric a few times. Eric quickly grabbed the girl's arm and pressed the answer button. Then the girl's excited voice sounded from the other end of the phone. Eric, we are now the richest people in the world. I want to buy a plane." Well, Eric couldn't help but smile and sigh in his heart. This girl really knows how to spend money. Elizabeth was already a little emotional because of the sudden interruption. When she heard Drew's voice, she was extremely jealous even though they didn't meet. Before Eric could speak, she said sarcastically into the phone, "Can you afford to buy a plane?" Although the girl was a little surprised to hear Elizabeth's voice, she did not hesitate to retort, "My man has plenty of money. Not only can he afford to buy a plane, but he can also afford to buy me. Are you jealous?" Elizabeth snatched the mobile phone from Eric's hand and retorted sarcastically, "You're really a B***tch to pester a man for money." "Haha, I've recorded it." On the other side, Drew was suddenly a little excited. "If I release this, housewives all over the world will have a good impression of the second daughter of the Murdoch family. Let's see how you're going to defend yourself then." Elizabeth did not believe that the girl would record the conversation just now. Unwilling to be outdone, she said, "Release it. If you don't release it, you're my daughter. If Eric is interested in this kind of play, I don't mind being your daughter." Drew's voice suddenly became a little tired. After saying this, Elizabeth's voice immediately sounded from the other end of the phone. "You're really a B***tch to pester a man for money." Elizabeth was about to retort when she heard the recording on the other end of the phone. She was stunned. What she said just now was indeed a little thoughtless. A large number of housewives in the United States did not work, and the entire family relied entirely on the income of their husbands. If this sentence full of ambiguity was leaked out, with her identity as the daughter of the head of News Corporation, it would definitely cause a storm of public opinion. Thinking about it, Elizabeth inexplicably felt wronged. She threw the mobile phone at Eric and threw herself on the bed. She even pulled a pillow over her head and whimpered in a low voice. Eric leaned over and patted Elizabeth a little helplessly. He picked up the phone and said to the girl, "Stop fooling around, hurry up and delete the recording." The girl on the other end of the phone immediately stopped being aggressive and said with a smile, "I've already deleted it. I was just scaring her. She's so stupid." "Eric, what do you think of the Boeing 777? It's the latest wide-body plane from Boeing. I heard that the largest size is 240 feet, 73 meters. It's similar to the office loft in the digital field. If we place an order now, we can get the first batch next year." Eric pulled the pillow away from Elizabeth's head and let the girl rest on his lap. He helped her tidy up her somewhat messy hair and deliberately said to the girl on the other end of the phone, "Why buy such a big plane? If you want, just buy a Gulfstream. You can play with it however you want, I don't care." No, a small business plane like the Gulfstream is not interesting at all. If we buy a large Boeing 777, we can still modify it. We can add a bar, a restaurant, a bedroom, a home theater and so on. We can even have a party on the plane. Eric, imagine inviting a bunch of beautiful women, and you being the only man on the plane. No man could resist the temptation of such a scene. Eric had just imagined it for a while when Elizabeth, who was resting on his lap, said, "Eric, if you really do that, Julia and I will never talk to you again. The girl's voice immediately came from the phone. Hey, you can just ignore us. It's best if you go back to Australia. Don't drag anyone else into this. Julia might not agree. You little b*tch. Eric, she's scolding me. Eric had to temporarily cover the phone and whispered to Elizabeth, Baby, help me prepare breakfast. I'll be right there. Elizabeth stood up angrily and added before she left, You're not allowed to buy a plane. Eric quickly nodded. Okay, I promise I won't buy one. It was very common for Western tycoons to own private planes. Even if Eric didn't buy one now, it was impossible for him not to buy one in the future. Therefore, although she knew that the possibility of this promise being fulfilled was not high, Elizabeth was still very satisfied with Eric's attitude and left the bedroom. After Elizabeth left, Eric said to the girl, I definitely can't buy a big plane for the time being. It's not like you don't know how much it costs to buy ABC television network. Wait for my companies to go public in 2 years, then I'll consider this matter again. As if she felt that Elizabeth had left, the girl became very easy to talk to. She did not have the slightest intention of refuting Eric. She said, Okay, Eric, today Amy and I are going to view the scenes for Mission Impossible. Do you want to come? I'm not going. Amy is a very experienced manager and producer. You should learn from her. Okay. After chatting with the girl for a long time, Eric hung up the phone. However, before he could put down the mobile phone, it rang again. This time, it was Chris from New York. After picking up the call, Chris smiled and complained about the busy line just now. Eric could only answer the phone while getting dressed and washing up. Later, Eric gradually realized that the influence of being ranked first on the Forbes 400 richest man in North America was far greater than he had imagined. The Motorola mobile phone in his hand had not left Eric's ear for the whole morning, until the battery was completely exhausted. The people who called him had all kinds of purposes. There was even a charity organization that Eric had never heard of that had somehow gotten his private number and called to persuade him to donate. Even Elizabeth's personal mobile phone rang, because of Eric. After she picked up the phone and understood the purpose of the call, she was embarrassed. After breakfast, Elizabeth was about to drive to work. However, she quickly returned because the gate of her mansion on the top of the mountain was filled with reporters. The narrow mountain path was completely blocked. She called her office and told them about it. After that, Elizabeth casually threw her mobile phone on the round table and complained to Eric, who was checking his email next to her. It's all your fault. They will definitely write nonsense tomorrow. Fortunately, Julia recently went to New York. Otherwise, how am I going to face people? Eric checked his email inbox that was already full of emails and deleted an interview invitation. He chuckled and said, Don't worry. I'm now the richest man in the Federation. Even if they know that I'm here, they won't dare to write nonsense without taking photos. Fighting a lawsuit against a celebrity will increase the reputation of the newspaper, but fighting a lawsuit against a billionaire will bankrupt the newspaper. With my current status, I'm obviously leaning towards the latter. Murdoch started out as a tabloid. Under his influence, Elizabeth was naturally aware of the rules. Although tabloids often dug up the privacy of celebrities by any means possible, they were also very clear about the people they should provoke and the people they shouldn't. Moreover, they were both unmarried. Even if they took photos of the two of them, the headlines given by these newspapers were often titles like North America's Richest Man's Relationship Exposed. At most, they would comment on their family background. Thinking of this, Elizabeth was a little excited. It seemed that it was not a bad idea to publicize this matter. Anyway, because she had to accompany Emma to adapt to life in New York, Julia was not in Los Angeles recently. The media could not take photos of the three of them. However, she quickly remembered that Eric had once fled when he heard the word marriage. She was a little disappointed and glared at Eric. Eric looked up and saw the girl's expression. He asked, What's wrong? Elizabeth turned her head. No, angry. Eric thought Elizabeth was angry because she could not go to work. He laughed and said, Have you forgotten? We are rich people. We don't have to drive to work. After that, Eric visually surveyed the spacious courtyard of the mansion, picked up Elizabeth's phone and dialed a number. More than half an hour later, a Bell helicopter roared and landed in the mansion. The method that was originally used to show the strength of Firefly pictures deviated a little, and made Eric a hot topic again. After leaving Elizabeth's house that day, Eric could no longer continue his low-key personal life. He could only obediently go back to the Pointy Corner villa every day, because there were many reporters following him around again, and perhaps there were also stalkers with ulterior motives. Eric had to increase his personal security. After the release of the Forbes 400 Richest People in North America list, Warren Buffett, whose wealth was far surpassed by Eric, published an article in the Washington Post the next day to publicly question the accuracy of Forbes magazine's data. The investment tycoon insisted that Eric's net worth was definitely not $19.7 billion, and only admitted that Eric's assets were worth $13 billion US. Warren Buffett, who had dominated the North American business world for 30 years, had a personal influence that was absolutely unimaginable to ordinary people. Therefore, after the article was published, it immediately attracted a lot of support. In order to maintain its credibility, Forbes magazine did not back down. Firefly, of course, also mobilized its own media resources to fight back against Warren Buffett's views. At the same time, many investment banks, financial evaluation agencies, professional financial media, and even many federal government departments participated in the battle of public opinion due to various interests involved. For a time, the general public was dazzled by the war of words in the media. Those who knew the ins and outs of this matter understood that this dispute was ultimately a dispute over the acquisition negotiations between ABC Television Network and Firefly Pictures. The main reason for this was that Firefly was not listed yet, so it was impossible to give an accurate valuation of Firefly Pictures through simple and clear data such as the price-to-earnings ratio. Therefore, there was a lot of room for manipulation for all parties. For ABC, if they acknowledged Eric's net worth, it would be equivalent to acknowledging the market value of Firefly Pictures of about $20 billion US, which was almost twice the market value of ABC Television Network. If this view became true, then ABC would not be able to gain any advantage in this acquisition negotiation. But if they could pull Eric's assets to the $13 billion US figure given by Buffett, then ABC Television Network, whose stock price had been rising, would basically be on par with Firefly Pictures. This would bring a huge advantage to ABC in the negotiation. Chapter 590. While the Forbes World's Billionaires list was controversial, after more than 2 months of intense gaming, Chris successfully acquired Ltd for $2.4 billion US. Leslie Wexney, Ltd's first shareholder, was kicked out. On the day of the signing of the contract, Ltd announced its merger with Brighton Fashion Company. Relying on a series of complex financial operations, Chris only used less than $1 billion US from beginning to end. In addition to the $600 million US invested by Firefly, the other $400 million US was debt financing through Brighton Fashion Company. After the completion of the acquisition and subsequent merger, Firefly Investment and Brighton Fashion Company held 62% of Ltd's shares, achieving complete control of the company. According to Wall Street rules, this is just the beginning. Chris explained the entire acquisition process to Eric in detail over the phone. He then said, "As long as we streamline and reorganize the company's departments, greatly improve the company's performance in the short term, and push up the stock price, then we can split up the business under Ltd and sell it. We'll have enough money to pay off the debt. This way, we can fully realize the acquisition cycle of an investment company." Unfortunately, before Chris could sigh, Emily's voice faintly came from the phone. "Chris, what are you feeling sorry for? We bought Ltd to run it, not to turn it into a personal toy for greedy and evil Wall Street thieves. Emily, I worked more than 12 hours a day for 2 consecutive months and just bought Ltd for you. Is this how you evaluate me?" Amidst the chuckles, Emily's voice sounded again, and it was getting louder and louder. "But this is the truth." Then the phone was probably snatched by Emily. Her voice revealed an uncontrollable excitement. "Hi Eric. Although it was not yet time to get off work in Los Angeles, it was probably already night in New York. Eric held his mobile phone and walked through the cement corridor of the park from the Firefly Post-Production Center. He pushed open the door and walked into the administrative building. He greeted an executive with his eyes and continued to speak into the phone. "Hi, Emily, are you having a party?" Emily replied. "Yes, Miss Roberts is here too." "Oh, and Emma, the little one is so cute. I heard she called you Daddy?" Listening to Emily's gossipy tone, Eric took the opportunity to satisfy her curiosity and said, "Yeah, I think this is a good way to teach Xiaxia and Kevin how to say Daddy in advance." Seeing that Eric didn't deny it at all, Emily seemed a little discouraged, but she quickly said, "By the way, I haven't congratulated you yet, Mr. World's richest man." "Thank you, but to be precise, I should be the richest man in America." The richest man in the United States is, of course, the richest man in the world. Emily's tone carried the unique confidence of an American. "However, you said that after taking over Ltd., you would personally tailor a publicity plan for the company. Can you start now?" I've been so busy recently. You guys are having a celebration party, but I have to go to a conference call now. I don't even know when I can get off work." Emily was not moved by Eric's words at all. She asked, "Then tell me what you plan to do first so I can prepare in advance." Eric pushed the door open and walked into the conference room. He greeted Michael Lin and the others who were already waiting there. He sat down in his seat and said to Emily quickly, "Then you can start contacting models. Don't limit yourself to the United States. Top models from Latin America, Europe, and Asia. Oh, by the way, they definitely can't be thin and stiff fashion models. First of all, they must have 3 measurements. Flat chests are absolutely out of the question. I plan to personally plan an underwear show for Victoria's Secret." Emily was about to continue asking, but Eric hurriedly said goodbye and hung up. He casually turned off the mobile phone. He had no choice. If he didn't turn off the phone, this conference wouldn't be able to continue peacefully. Putting the Motorola aside, Eric looked at the conference call on the table and asked Alan, who was sitting next to him, "Is Jeffrey online?" Alan raised his head and was about to answer when Jeffrey's voice came from the conference call speaker. "Eric, I'm here." "That's good." Eric habitually clapped his hands. "Let's get started, Jeffrey. Tell everyone what happened this afternoon." Katzenberg paused for a moment on the phone, as if he was sorting out his thoughts. He quickly introduced the latest situation that happened during the afternoon's negotiation process. During the afternoon's negotiation process, the representative of ABC television network suddenly stopped using the seesaw tactics as before. Their attitude during the negotiation process also became tough, and for the first time, they clearly proposed a deal that ABC could accept. ABC management offered a price of $71 per share, of which $23.8 would be converted into a total of about 30% of Firefly Pictures shares, and $47.6 would be paid in cash. In addition, ABC management also asked that the 14.7 million ABC television network shares in our hands could only be converted into non-voting preferred shares. After making this condition, the representative of ABC said that until we give a final reply, they will not start negotiations again. I personally think that ABC management must be under pressure from shareholders again. They want to complete this merger and acquisition transaction as soon as possible. This situation should be related to the recent media situation. It can be said that the media public relations strategy we set at the beginning has worked. As soon as Katzenberg finished speaking, Alan, who was sitting next to Eric, handed a draft paper full of calculation results to Eric. The total share capital of ABC Television Network was about 210 million shares. According to the price per share proposed by ABC, the final transaction amount was $15 billion. $23.8 was equivalent to 30% of the price per share. That was to say, ABC wanted to exchange 30% of its shares for 30% of Firefly Pictures shares and $10 billion in cash. Before the public acquisition was issued, Firefly had already obtained 7% of ABC Television Network shares, which was the 7 million shares mentioned by Katzenberg. These shares could not be ignored in the merger process. Although even if this deal was reached, ABC's shareholders would never be able to get enough say in Firefly. ABC's strategy of asking for these shares to be converted into non-voting preferred shares was still to weaken Eric's control. Eric quickly read the data handed to him by Alan, and then handed the draft paper to Jeffrey on his right. Several people in the conference room quickly read it. After everyone finished reading the data analysis, Michael Lind said, "This plan should be drawn up by Warren Buffett." Although ABC has made a big concession in the share exchange, ABC and Firefly are estimated to be equal. Both of us are $15 billion, which coincides with Buffett's recent media comments. Frank Wales said, "If we can be sure that ABC's management is indeed under pressure from other shareholders besides Buffett, maybe we can have enough initiative." There was some strange sound coming from the conference phone. Katzenberg seemed to be talking to someone in a low voice. After a while he said, "This matter should be confirmed. David West, the president of the State Street Global Fund, just called and invited me to dinner." The State Street Global Fund owns 3.9% of ABC television network shares. When the other three people in the conference room heard Katzenberg's words, they all looked at Eric with excitement. Obviously, although the debate about Eric's personal assets had not stopped in recent days, no one could deny the fact that Eric had created the miracle of Firefly Pictures in just 6 years. As the media dug deeper and deeper into the information related to Firefly Pictures, the other shareholders of ABC Television Network could no longer sit still in the face of the rapid growth of Firefly Pictures' strength and scale. They wanted to join the Firefly Pictures camp as soon as possible. The invitation from the president of the State Street Global Fund was a hint that could not be more obvious. Everyone could imagine that if Katzenberg went to the banquet, what awaited him would definitely not be the president of the State Street Global Fund alone, but perhaps other shareholders of ABC Television Network. Jeffrey looked at Eric, who was thinking silently. After waiting for a while, he finally couldn't help but say, "Eric, if we can avoid Warren Buffett and Tom Murphy, get the shares in the hands of other shareholders, and even get the controlling shares, then we will have enough strength to promote the cooperation between ABC and Firefly alone." Eric shook his head and said, "It's definitely not possible to avoid Buffett. If he realizes that he has been betrayed by other shareholders of ABC, then things will definitely get worse. Don't forget, Tom Murphy is not only a major shareholder of ABC Television Network, but also the current head of ABC Television Network. He has enough strength to completely mess up the situation of ABC Television Network. Moreover, their shares are close to 40% after all. If there is a stalemate in the future, ABC Television Network will definitely be our battlefield. What I want is a strong national television network, not a wasteland." Frank Wales said, "Then what should we do next? To be honest, I still want to finish this as soon as possible and then go on a vacation." Eric was stunned. When he heard Frank Wales say the word vacation, some information appeared in his mind. He suddenly looked up and said, "Frank, where do you plan to go on vacation?" In his memory, Frank Wales had died in a helicopter crash while he was on vacation in 1994. "The Alps," Frank Wales replied with a smile, but he quickly added, "Of course, if the work here requires it, I can go next year." Then next year. Eric also realized that he had overreacted. He pretended to smile as if nothing had happened and said, "You can rest for a while next year, but I'm afraid you can't this year. Even if the acquisition is completed, there are still a lot of follow-up matters. You're Jeffrey's deputy. Of course, you can't leave at this time." Frank Wales had already been greatly affected by the butterfly effect. Even if he went on a vacation this year, he probably wouldn't encounter such a coincidence again. Eric pushed the matter back a year. If he could still encounter such misfortune, then it could only be considered as heaven's will. No problem." Frank Wales agreed with a smile and said, "Eric, let's get down to business." "Yes." Eric nodded and said, "I think that since some of ABC's shareholders are already leaning towards our side and have put pressure on ABC's management again, we can also add some chips on our side to increase the pressure on ABC. Even if we can hold a shareholders meeting to vote in the end, It would be best to get rid of the management and complete the deal. This method is feasible, Katzenberg said over the conference call. If we release the news that the acquisition negotiations between ABC and Firefly are falling apart next year, then the initiative will definitely return to our side. In addition, I'll go to David West's banquet later. I can also invite them to publicly speak out in the media to facilitate this deal. Michael Lynn also added, "We have 14.7 million shares of ABC shares in our hands. If we sell a batch of them in the next few days to suppress ABC's share price, I believe the show will be more realistic." The few of them quickly discussed the specific plan. Because Katzenberg still had to attend the banquet, Eric did not let the meeting last too long. After the final plan was finalized, Eric said, "Since this matter has reached the final stage, then we have to be prepared. Before this year's Academy Awards, I hope that both sides can finally reach a deal agreement. Therefore, it can be said that this operation is not a show. Because we don't have much time, after the deal is completed, we still have to make a series of arrangements for ABC before the fall slot. All of this takes time. If we can't complete the acquisition before then, we have to decisively change our target." A few days ago, General Electric's CEO, Jack Welch, sent me an email. General Electric has absolute control of NBC, so the negotiations are much easier than ABC's. As long as we can deal with General Electric, then we can take over NBC. Of course, this is only the final choice. We have done so much work for ABC. Firefly will never give up until the last moment. Because NBC no longer had friends in the original space-time, and because NBC's management had been in a standoff with General Electric's management in recent years, the network was in a mess. General Electric also had plans to make a move. Therefore, if they wanted to acquire NBC, it would be much easier than ABC. Chapter 591. In Omaha, the capital of Nebraska, in a typical middle-class house on Farnham Street in the city center, Warren Buffett hung up a call from New York. He stood by the window of the studio on the second floor and looked out of the window with a hint of annoyance between his eyebrows. Today was Saturday. Although he didn't go to work at Hathaway, Warren Buffett still maintained his working state. On the side of the road outside the window, a conspicuous Cadillac stopped. A family of four dressed decently got out of the car, pointed at Buffett's house, and then excitedly took pictures of each other. Buffett used to feel a little proud when he saw this. He even joked proudly to his friends that he might be one of the few living legends in the United States who had his picture taken in front of his house. But today, Buffett didn't feel the slightest bit of self-satisfaction. Thinking of what happened in the past few days, Buffett's eyebrows furrowed again. Ever since Firefly Pictures released their annual financial report in January, which was out of the ordinary, Buffett had predicted Firefly Pictures' intentions. According to the company's own situation, the time of year financial statistics varied. Some were at the end of the year, some were after the tax season, and some were in the autumn after the peak season. ABC usually released the financial information for the full fiscal year after the spring program. But in order to fight back, ABC deliberately released its own performance information in 1993 in advance. However, although the media in ABC's camp did their best to exaggerate how rare ABC's 23% market share was and repeatedly emphasized the uncertainty of the film company's profits, and that Firefly's huge profit of $1.19 billion was full of luck, ordinary people, and even most shareholders only saw the superficial fact that Firefly's annual profit was more than twice that of ABC. In order to attract attention, many media outlets added fuel to the fire and touted the status of Firefly Pictures higher and higher. Ever since Firefly Pictures revealed that they were going to enter the TV industry, Buffett had never stopped studying Firefly Pictures. He found that in the first few years when Eric made a name for himself with kids in charge, he relied on some unconventional comedies or horror films to make huge profits from the box office market in a short period of time. Although these miraculous box office movies proved that the young man had an excellent vision in film production, it was impossible for these low-budget movies to be successful all the time, especially after other studios increased their investment in similar movies. If Firefly Pictures did not yield to the big studios, their competitive advantage would become smaller and smaller. Perhaps, like many independent film production companies that flashed away like shooting stars, this miraculous film production company might also fall quickly. But things didn't develop on this track. Since 3 years ago, Firefly Pictures had abandoned the idea of making movies with a small budget. They relied on Pixar Animation Studio and Digital Domain Special Effects Company to open up two very stable profit routes: 3D animation movies and special effects movies. The success of big-budget movies such as Terminator 2, Tornado, and Toy Story laid the foundation of Firefly Pictures in Hollywood time and time again. Firefly Pictures eventually swallowed up Disney, an established film company, and became one of the 7 major film companies in Hollywood. Buffett highly advocated a theory called bridge toll booth. In short, if you had a bridge channel from A to B, then you could use this bridge to make stable and generous profits. Buffett's investment decisions in the Washington Post, Coca-Cola, and ABC were all influenced by this bridge toll booth theory to a certain extent. In the process of studying Firefly Pictures, Buffett found that Firefly Pictures' Pixar Animation Studio and Digital Domain Special Effects Company had this kind of bridge toll booth effect. Eric Williams invested tens of millions of dollars in Toy Story and Terminator 2 before the release of Terminator 2. This was basically impossible for a major Hollywood film company, where most investment decisions were constrained by the board of directors and shareholders. Eric Williams' huge investment years in advance of other companies created the two unique toll bridges of Firefly Pictures. In the past 3 years, Firefly Pictures had been enjoying the huge dividends brought by this monopolistic toll bridge. Judging from the popularity of CG special effects films and 3D animation in the North American and even global markets, as long as Firefly Pictures could maintain the technical advantage of Pixar Animation Studio and Digital Domain, the toll bridge effect of the two subsidiaries would not fail for many years to come. On the other hand, although ABC made a high profit of $520 million last year, the network was still in crisis. Even 10 years ago, the U.S. television industry was still firmly dominated by the 3 major television networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. At that time, even if the 3 major television networks were not doing well, they could easily get 30% of the market share. But since the rapid rise of national cable channels in the 1980s, the 3 major television networks were not doing well. In the late 1980s, Rupert Murdoch from Australia created the Fox Public Television Network and successfully established a foothold in North America, which once again shook the market position of the 3 major television networks. In this case, Buffett realized that the toll bridge effect of ABC was getting lower and lower. Therefore, after Firefly Pictures threw an olive branch to ABC, Buffett quickly became interested in this business. However, Firefly Pictures was far more difficult to deal with than he thought. Buffett had never thought of himself as a greedy person. Therefore, when he first met Eric, he gave him what he thought was a very generous offer. However, the young man rejected it without even thinking about it. Eric's proposed cash purchase made Buffett realize that Eric did not care much about the amount of money Firefly was willing to spend. He just wanted to pay as little as possible for Firefly's shares as possible, and the formal negotiations that followed proved this point. Ever since Buffett felt that the ABC network's bridge toll booth effect was failing, he had the idea of cashing out Berkshire Hathaway's ABC shares. Before Firefly Pictures proposed the acquisition, he had already sold some of his shares. But in the face of Firefly Pictures' insistence in the negotiations, Buffett, who also had a stubborn personality, did not make too many concessions, and the private contact ended in failure. But Buffett was a very rational person. Since he was optimistic about this business, Buffett would not give up easily. He also knew that Firefly would never change its acquisition target so easily. After Firefly Pictures publicly announced the acquisition, Buffett also pushed for the acquisition negotiations between the management of the two sides. Then, especially in the past week, Buffett found that this matter had begun to get out of control. The last time he felt this sense of loss was 4 years ago when Salomon Brothers was in crisis. Then Salomon, the king of Wall Street in the 1980s, declined in just a few years. Because Buffett took over the company while Salomon Brothers was under investigation, many people put the blame for Salomon's decline on him. While thinking about how to deal with the recent events, Buffett saw a black car drive into the house. His investment partner, Charlie Munger, who was also the vice president of Berkshire Hathaway, got out of the car. Charlie Munger looked up and saw the figure in front of the window, then waved at Buffett. When he came to Buffett's studio, Charlie Munger hugged Buffett and said, "The situation looks a little bad recently. I think I should come in person." Buffett let out a relaxed smile and ordered Ashtray Minks, who was actually his girlfriend, to prepare some cola for the two of them. He then passed some documents on the table that he had flipped through many times to Charlie Munger. "Take a look first." Charlie Munger had his own business. Although he was also a shareholder of Berkshire Hathaway, he did not pay as much attention to the progress of the ABC acquisition as Buffett. Until 4 days ago, when the media suddenly reported that the acquisition negotiations between Firefly and ABC were about to break down. And then the Los Angeles Times confirmed that the two sides had suspended contact, Charlie Munger had to take it seriously. In the following few working days, because of this bad news, the stock price of ABC, which had risen to a high of $52, quickly fell. In just 3 days, it fell by 9.6%, and the stock price returned to the level at the beginning of the year. At the same time, because of a series of unconfirmed rumors, the stock price of the other 3 public television networks, NBC, CBS, and Fox, rose by more than 5%. After quickly skimming through the documents in his hand, Charlie Munger raised his head and said, "Based on the current situation, if we don't agree to this deal, the other shareholders may initiate an interim shareholders meeting to vote." Buffett found a letter on his desk and handed it to Charlie Munger. He said in a heavy tone, "It's not a possibility. This is a text message from David West, the president of State Street Global Fund. They're already planning to do so." Charlie Munger took out the letter and glanced at it. He scolded angrily. "These idiots, don't they know which side they should be on?" Buffett did not mind his friend's loss of composure. He sighed slightly and said, "If ABC was the only public television network in the United States, of course, they would stand firmly on our side. But unfortunately, ABC is not the only option for Firefly Pictures. If it weren't for the fact that ABC's operating conditions are far better than the other two, perhaps they would have already given up. This is the reason why David West and the others are so anxious. Everyone can see that the business of the public television network is shrinking, so they are unwilling to give up this opportunity to cash out at a high price. Besides, they can also get a share of Firefly Pictures shares. There are no more than 50 companies in the entire federation that can achieve an annual profit of $1 billion US. Charlie Munger felt a little lonely in Buffett's tone and said with a smile, "But we're not bad at all, are we?" The disappointment caused by the miraculous rise of the latecomers only stayed in Buffett's mind for a few seconds. When he heard Charlie Munger's words, Buffett quickly regained his usual confident smile and said, "Of course we're not bad at all." "Okay, buddy." Charlie Munger reached over and patted Buffett on the shoulder. "Let's discuss what to do now. Do you have any good ideas?" Originally, there was one. Buffett skillfully pulled out a piece of paper from the pile of documents on his desk and handed it to Charlie Munger. Charlie Munger looked down and saw that it was a movie release schedule cut out from the newspaper. Some of the movies had asterisks behind them. Saving Private Ryan, The Lion King, True Lies. Charlie Munger looked at the names of the movies and looked up to ask, "These 3 movies are the main movies of Firefly Pictures' summer release. Is there a problem?" Buffett nodded and said, "Of course. Saving Private Ryan is a war movie, The Lion King is a traditional hand-drawn animation, and True Lies is a very ordinary big action movie. The cost is very high, reaching $100 million US. Charlie Munger was not very good at movies. He knew very well that Buffett was the same. It was just that Buffett had done much more work than him during this period of time, so he could only nod and listen patiently. Buffett paused for a moment to give his friend time to think, then continued, "I called Robert Daly of Warner Brothers to ask about this matter. Hollywood hasn't had a big war movie like Saving Private Ryan for many years because the risk of failure is very high. Firefly's distribution strategy for The Lion King is also very different from the traditional distribution method. This kind of 2D hand-drawn animation is usually shown at the end of the year. Although there are no competitors in the same genre during the summer, this kind of very competitive schedule will greatly shorten the screening time of 2D animation. Finally, True Lies. Last year, two similar action movies in the same genre ended in failure at the same time during the summer. The protagonist of one of them was the male lead of True Lies, Schwarzenegger. Now Hollywood is very cautious about this kind of big action movie project. Charlie Munger thought of the information he had just read and said, "You mean Firefly Pictures has completely given up on the CG special effects movies and 3D animation movies that they were better at a few years ago? And it is very likely that they will fail with these 3 movies this year?" Buffett nodded and said, "So I think that if the negotiations can be delayed until the summer, as long as Firefly Pictures' summer movie fails, then the miracle of Firefly Pictures' successful movie investment will be broken. Then we can take back the initiative again." Charlie Munger nodded in agreement, but he soon spread his hands and said, "But the situation now is that Firefly will definitely not give ABC so much time, right?" Buffett showed a faint wry smile and said, "Yes, and judging from the recent signs of Firefly Pictures' frequent moves, I feel that if the deal is not completed this month, they may really give up. You started selling ABC shares at the beginning of last year. I think you must also want to make this deal, right?" Buffett did not hide anything from his friend of many years. He nodded honestly and said, "Yes." Charlie Munger said, "Then what do you think is the upper limit of Eric Williams' offer? I think it should not be difficult for you to guess this data, right?" Buffett was best at data analysis. He nodded and said, "The focus of the dispute is the share exchange. I think he may only give up 25% of the shares at most now." After saying this, Buffett was a little annoyed. "If David West can hold back a little longer, the 30% deal I proposed on Monday may be effective. At most, he will give up another 2 percentage points. How about this?" Charlie Munger knocked on the table and suggested, "You contact Tom. How about the 3 of us go to Los Angeles? Maybe we can join in the fun at the Oscars." Buffett shook his head gently and said, "I don't think this will make the young man give in. He already has the advantage now. I think that if the 3 of us old guys come forward personally, as long as the young man is smart enough, he will definitely give in." Buffett knew what his friend meant. He, Charlie Munger, and Tom Murphy had been rising in the federal business world for decades. They had all kinds of tangible and intangible resources in their hands. As long as they were willing to take them out in exchange, they would definitely be able to exchange for real benefits. But these benefits will not fall on us for free. If we reap the benefits in advance, we will still have to pay in the future. I don't think Eric Williams will let us take advantage of him. Charlie Munger saw that although Buffett said this, he had already agreed. He picked up the phone on Buffett's table and prepared to arrange a private jet. He said, "I'm getting more and more interested in that young man. And the cliff villa he built in Malibu. The last time I chatted with John Bond, he said that there is probably no other place in the world that is so good to build a private manor. If Eric Williams is willing to sell it, he is willing to buy that pointy corner manor for $200 million US. Although Buffett did not have any particular pursuit of material wealth, he did not hide his true thoughts. He nodded and said, "That villa is really good. Although its actual value is definitely not as high as $200 million US. Eric Williams will definitely not sell it for $200 million US. He is not short of money at all." Charlie Munger dialed a number and said a few simple words. He then put down the receiver and said, "Haha, I almost forgot about this. Your title of richest man was taken away by him after only a year. Are you a little disappointed?" Buffett actually enjoyed the feeling of being in the limelight very much. Of course, he was a little disappointed. However, he still commented in a professional manner, "It shouldn't have been mine in the first place. He hid the data last year. I can still see that." Chapter 592. Many years later, Private Ryan, who was already in his twilight years, once again came to the cemetery of the fallen soldiers in Normandy where 120,000 lives were buried. Stroking the name on the white tombstone that was engraved in his heart, he felt as if he had returned to the past. The sound of the waves around the landing craft was like the uneasy cries of soldiers before a great battle. Captain Miller habitually opened the aluminum kettle with trembling fingers and took a big gulp of water. His deputy also stuffed a ball of chocolate into his mouth. Everyone was trying to keep themselves calm. With the prompt that the helmsman was about to land, Captain Miller and his deputy, Horvat, began to urge the soldiers to pay attention to when they landed. However, these words seemed to have no effect. The hatch opened, and the rapid sound of machine gun fire immediately caused a large number of soldiers in the cabin to fall down before they could react. This kind of tragic scene that didn't give people any buffer time made many of the audience in the screening room gasp. The constantly shaking lens of the portable camera gave people the illusion that they were in the scene. The next scene was even more nerve-wracking. Some people struggled to jump into the sea, but they were hit by bullets and never surfaced again. Some people struggled to move toward the shore, but before they could get close to the beach, they fell on the way. Some people dragged their wounded comrades, but after the sound of gunfire, they found that only half of the body was left in their hands. Eric saw that a female executive from the distribution department sitting not far away on his left had covered her eyes. Most of the others also had a solemn look on their faces. He glanced at Catherine next to him. The woman's fingers were tightly gripping the armrest of the chair. She was obviously in a bad mood. After the 20-minute landing battle in Normandy ended, as the camera cut to the mailroom, Eric clearly felt that everyone in the screening room was greatly relieved. Some people raised their hands as if they wanted to applaud the successful battle scene. But they quickly realized that such a reaction was not suitable for this kind of movie, so they put it down. Eric looked at Catherine, who did not relax at all, patted her hand, leaned over and whispered, "Why don't we go out for a walk?" This was the first internal screening of Saving Private Ryan, after the final editing was completed. Catherine shook her head and said, "That's not good, is it?" Eric stretched out his hand and drew a line downwards as he said softly, "Your back is so straight that it's blocking other people's view." Catherine was already extremely nervous. When she heard Eric's slightly joking words, she relaxed a lot. She felt Eric directly grabbing her hand and wanting to pull her away. Catherine quickly broke free, but she had already left her seat. She could only walk out of the theater with Eric. The screening room was on the first floor of the administrative building of Firefly Cineplex. The two left the screening room and closed the door to isolate the sound of the movie. The surroundings immediately quieted down. As it was a Saturday, there were not many people working overtime in the administrative building, although there were still many crew members working in the studio. Eric put his hands in his pockets and looked at Catherine, who was wearing a black leather jacket and jeans, and said, "Do you want to go to my office for a cup of coffee? Anyway, we've already seen it many times. We'll come over when they're done." Catherine did not dare to be alone in the same room with this little man who always made her feel uneasy. She pointed to the cement corridor outside the floor-to-ceiling glass window and said, "Let's go outside for a walk." Okay. Eric took the lead and walked away. The Praia Vista Cineplex was generally rectangular in the northeast direction, parallel to the Bologna Canal that flowed through the downtown area of Culver City. Eric looked at Catherine, who was still looking back at him with some worry in her eyes as she walked out of the administrative building. He found a topic and said, "Catherine, I've always been curious. Do you know the meaning of the Ballona, in the name of the Bologna Canal next to the Cineplex?" As Catherine had a deep understanding of classical oil paintings, she was very familiar with some of the Western mythological figures involved in them. Although she was a little absent-minded, she did not hesitate to blurt out, "That's a tall and beautiful war goddess in ancient Rome." After saying this, the woman immediately realized something and glared at Eric. However, there was no anger in her eyes at all. Instead, there was a trace of imperceptible shyness. Eric smiled and said, "I think the name Bologna is quite nice. It suits you very well. The name Catherine is too common." Then, do you know that Bologna's counterpart in Greek mythology, the war goddess Enio, is a very bloody and cruel woman? Legend has it that after the Trojan horse massacred the city, Blood flowed like a river in Troy. However, she drank all the blood in the city while she was drunk. Eric spread his hands innocently and said, "You don't have to study this kind of thing so deeply. I've never heard of such an unpopular side story." The corners of Catherine's mouth curled up slightly. With a faint smile, she said, "You were the one who started this topic first." "Okay, it's my fault." Eric smiled and shook his head. "Then let's talk about something else. What are your plans next?" Catherine said, "I'm going to rest for a while and travel around before coming back to work. Do you still remember Becky? She said that Columbia University will be holding a pop art exhibition next week. I plan to go and take a look." Eric only vaguely knew that pop art was a representation of popular culture. As for what it was specifically, he did not delve into it. "Maybe I'll also go to New York soon. Will you still stay in that hotel in Soho District?" Catherine thought of the time they spent together at 60 Soho Hotel 3 years ago. Everything was as clear as yesterday. She could not help but say, "Maybe, but also, maybe I'll stay at Becky's house. It's not good to disturb others. I have a high-rise apartment at the exit of 6th Avenue. You can see Central Park. Maybe you can stay there." Catherine stopped and stared at Eric for a few seconds. Seeing that the little man did not look guilty at all, she felt embarrassed. You still need to stay there. I'll go to the hotel. That way, no one will disturb us." Eric still had a faint smile on his face. He said calmly, "Okay, give me a call after you stay there. Maybe we can still be neighbors." Catherine felt that she had an impulse to run away. This little bastard, how can he be so persistent? He's too shameless. The woman's heart was in a panic. Finally, she thought of a way to change the topic. She said, "When the movie was finished, why did you ask me to keep those props? Those things are in the warehouse in Ireland. It costs a lot of storage fees every month." In order to shoot Saving Private Ryan, the crew had prepared thousands of sets of military uniforms from various countries during World War II, as well as a number of landing craft, off-road vehicles, and other miscellaneous props. These things cost tens of millions of dollars. Of course, Eric could not casually dispose of them after the movie was finished like many movies. Moreover, he had a better way to recycle them. Although it was very interesting to see the woman awkwardly change the topic, Eric did not continue to tease Catherine. It would be bad if he scared her away. "I plan to use these things to make a mini-series about World War II, and it will be in the same vein as the story of Ryan. It will also reflect the story of a company deep in the enemy's rear after the Normandy landing in World War II. Catherine, you've done so much preparation before, so you must know more about World War II history than I do. Are you interested in being the producer of this mini-series?" Catherine did not answer directly. Instead, she asked, "The cost of a war drama should be very high, right? How much do you plan to use to make it?" "With these props and the production team of Ryan, the production cost of each episode will not be more than 10 million. I plan to make 10 episodes first. That's $100 million. Ryan only cost 70 million. I'm still worried about whether I can recoup the cost, but you want to use 100 million to make a TV series." Catherine shook her head and then laughed. She looked at Eric and said, "I almost forgot, you're now the richest man in America. You don't lack money at all." Eric had recently gotten used to people teasing him. He laughed and said, "I'm the richest man in America, but I'm not a fool. Don't worry, after Ryan is released, it will definitely cause a wave of war dramas. Taking the opportunity to launch a miniseries like this, it won't be a problem to recoup the cost through multiple channels. I just happen to want to buy a television network. Using this miniseries can also improve the network's brand effect." Catherine shook her head. "I don't understand these things, but I've heard some news. I heard that your negotiations with ABC have broken down?" Eric said, "It hasn't broken down, but it's at the final stage. It depends on whether ABC is willing to take a step back. If it goes well, I'll go to New York next week to attend the signing ceremony. Today is the 12th, and the Academy Awards will be held on the 21st, Catherine said. Suddenly, she did not know if she was relieved or disappointed. If that was the case, Eric would definitely not stay in New York for more than a few days. I heard that they invited you to present the Best Picture award this time. This has rarely happened before. Due to the butterfly effect, Schindler's List, which was supposed to appear this year, was brought forward by a year. This year was a minor Oscar year, and none of the famous directors released their personal works. For the sake of viewership ratings, the Oscar organizing committee personally invited Eric to participate in this year's awards ceremony at the beginning of the year. At first, they hoped that Eric would be the first to appear to boost the popularity of the awards ceremony. However, in March, after the new issue of Forbes magazine was released, they changed their mind. They hoped that Eric would appear last and present the heavyweight Best Picture award. This kind of award was usually given by respected Hollywood celebrities. However, with Eric's current strength and reputation in Hollywood, no one would think that he was not qualified to present the Best Picture award. Speaking of the Oscars, ICM is holding a warm-up party at the Sunset Tower Hotel tonight. Kapoor called and invited me to appear. Your agency contract is also with ICM, right? Do you want to go with me? Catherine shook her head and said, No, I plan to go home early to rest. Eric saw a flash of interest in Catherine's expression, but she immediately rejected it. After pondering for a while, he thought of a possible reason. Not only Catherine, but because of the cooperation with Firefly Pictures, Cameron's agency contract was also with ICM. Catherine obviously did not want to meet Cameron, so Eric did not say anything else. The two of them walked around the park corridor and had a cup of coffee in the cafe. When they felt that Saving Private Ryan was about to end, they walked towards the administrative building. When they walked into the screening room, the fluorescent lights were already on. The executives and publicity department employees who were attending the internal screening were whispering. When they saw Eric and Catherine walk in, everyone stopped chatting. After a moment of silence, everyone started clapping. Because the negotiations were suspended, Katzenberg, who had rushed back from New York to attend the internal screening, walked over and said, Miss Catherine, congratulations on making a great movie. If I didn't see it with my own eyes, I would never believe it. Catherine knew that Katzenberg did not say everything. He definitely meant that he would never believe that this was made by a woman. However, Catherine did not mind. She smiled and shook hands with Katzenberg. Thank you for your affirmation, Jeffrey. Katzenberg nodded and then said to Eric, However, Eric, there are two very important problems with this movie. One is the duration. It's 170 minutes, close to 3 hours. I suggest that it's best to edit it again. The other is the rating. If we cut out the overly bloody parts of this movie, it might be able to get a PG-13, but it will lose the authenticity of the scene. However, if we don't modify it, it will definitely get an R rating. Eric knew Katzenberg's character very well. As a workaholic, although Katzenberg was good at communicating with executives, he often became straightforward when it came to work. Therefore, he did not mind Katzenberg's confession. He said, Jeffrey, the rough version of this movie is 4.5 hours. Catherine and I have already trimmed it to the greatest extent. I don't think it can be shortened to 170 minutes. As for the R rating, Terminator 2 has already proven that an R rating does not mean a box office failure, so there's nothing to worry about. After all, this is a war movie. Katzenberg himself also realized this. After hearing Eric's confirmation, he did not continue to pester him. As a professional filmmaker, he also felt that the plot of this movie was so tight that it could not be modified anymore. However, out of professional instinct, he gave his opinion to Eric. Chapter 593. Saving Private Ryan was the first blockbuster film released by Firefly Pictures this summer. Therefore, after the final cut was completed yesterday, the management of Firefly could not wait to hold an internal test screening even though it was a Saturday. After watching the film, many of the executives who participated in the test screening had similar doubts as Katzenberg. The quality of the film was absolutely impeccable. From the plot to the soundtrack, they were all top-notch. However, the overly realistic and tragic scenes, the film's nearly 3-hour duration, and the film's possible R rating were the focus of everyone's doubts. However, Firefly's outstanding performance over the past few years meant that the company would not fall into a crisis, because of the failure of one or two big-budget films. In addition, the film was personally approved by the big boss, Eric, so even if the film failed, the management would not bear too much responsibility. Therefore, the people present did not have much psychological pressure. Instead, they dutifully put forward their own suggestions for the details of the film's publicity. Eric's original plan was for Saving Private Ryan to be officially released on June 6, 1994, the 50th anniversary of the Normandy landing. Unfortunately, June 6 happened to be Monday, the first day of the working week. The weekly box office statistics cycle in North America was from Friday to the following Thursday. Some films might choose to be released on Wednesday or Thursday, but for the sake of box office data, unless it was a very special date, very few film companies would choose to release on Monday, the time when people were least eager to watch a movie. Therefore, the unanimous conclusion of everyone's discussion was that the 50th anniversary of the Normandy landing did not have a strong impact on the box office. It could not be considered a very special date. Eric's suggestion was unanimously opposed, and finally, it was decided that the film's release date would be brought forward to June 3rd. By the time the detailed publicity plan for Saving Private Ryan was completed, it was already 4 o'clock in the afternoon. After all, it was the weekend. After finishing their work, everyone quickly dispersed. After leaving the conference room, Catherine's originally anxious mood finally relaxed. Until now, she still remembered that after completing her first feature film, Ruthless, the executives of the small production company had harshly pointed out a series of corrections at the first test screening. Although the production cost of Saving Private Ryan was dozens of times that of Ruthless, such a situation did not happen today. Most of the people who attended the test screening were discussing the details of the film's publicity. She could not help but look at the laid-back young man walking beside her. She knew that if it were not for this young man's patience and intervention during the editing period, the effect of Saving Private Ryan would not have been as good as it was today. At the thought of this, Catherine's resentment towards Eric for forcibly cutting out some of her favorite scenes disappeared without a trace. Catherine was staring at the young man's side profile in a daze when Eric suddenly turned his head with a faint smile on his lips. "Looking at your hesitant look, do you want to invite me to dinner tonight?" "Hee, then I'll agree." Catherine wasn't annoyed by Eric's scoundrel tone. She only rolled her eyes at him. "Didn't you say that you're going to ICM's Oscar preview party tonight?" "We have to attend the party, and we have to eat dinner," Eric said with a smile. "Everyone knows that it's hard to fill your stomach at that kind of party." Catherine was hesitating about what to do when there was a rush of footsteps behind them. Katzenberg's voice was heard. "Eric, wait a minute." The two stood still. When Katzenberg came closer, Eric realized that there was an unconcealable excitement on his face. "Eric, I just received a call." "It's..." Katzenberg suddenly stopped talking and glanced at Catherine. He knew that Eric and Catherine had an unusual relationship. Otherwise, he would never have spent $70 million to film a war film like Saving Private Ryan, which was a very risky investment. However, Katzenberg did not know how far the two of them had reached. Eric was about to let Katzenberg continue when Catherine took the initiative to say goodbye. "You guys chat then. I'll go back first." The woman walked towards the parking lot after saying that. Katzenberg noticed Eric's gloomy expression and opened his mouth with a smile. However, he immediately thought of something and swallowed his words. If Catherine was a girl about the same age as Eric, Katzenberg might have teased Eric, and he believed that Eric would not be angry. However, Katzenberg could not help but shake his head when he thought of Catherine's age. However, under normal circumstances, Western women were always difficult to maintain. However, Catherine looked like she was in her 30s, and she had a temperament that even he could not help but be moved. It was no wonder that his little boss would be so attentive. Watching Catherine drive away, Eric asked, "Jeffrey, what happened?" "Oh, it's like this." Katzenberg also collected his thoughts and regained his excited look. "I just received a call. Warren Buffett, Tom Murphy, and another Berkshire partner, Charlie Munger, arrived in Los Angeles in the afternoon. The three of them are now staying at Buffett's vacation villa in Los Angeles." Buffett and Tom Murphy actually came to Los Angeles. Eric was surprised. Then he guessed Buffett's intention and subconsciously wanted to contact Jeffrey and the others for a meeting. As soon as he took out his phone, Eric's mobile phone rang. It must be about this matter. Jeffrey waved to Eric and said, "You answer the phone. I'll contact Jeffrey and the others." Eric pressed the answer button, and Kapoor's mysterious voice came from the other end of the phone. "Eric, a friend just called and asked me for a few invitations to tonight's pre-party. Guess who is coming?" Eric smiled and said 3 names. Warren Buffett, Tom Murphy and Charlie Munger. Kapoor was clearly stunned for a moment. Then he smiled and said, "I should have thought about it. Someone will definitely inform you of such an important matter. Then you should make the necessary preparations. I need to contact the security company to increase the security for tonight's party. By the way, I originally invited some reporters tonight. Do you want me to cancel this segment?" Eric said, "No need. Since the 3 of them have come to Los Angeles, the initiative this time is completely on Firefly's side. And it's basically impossible to keep this kind of thing a secret." The media all over the world had been focusing on Firefly's acquisition of ABC TV during this time. Warren Buffett and the other 2 didn't hide their whereabouts too much when they appeared in Los Angeles. If the reporters couldn't discover the mystery, they would be too incompetent. Moreover, since Buffett and the others had personally come to find him, Eric didn't want to keep it a secret. In fact, he even wanted this matter to be as lively as possible. The sky had just fallen, and a large number of reporters had already gathered outside the Sunset Tower Hotel in Hollywood. There were even 2 TV broadcast vehicles. The guests who came to attend the ICM Oscar pre-party quickly realized that something was unusual. There were hundreds of parties before and after the Oscars every year, but none of them could attract such a large amount of media attention. Most people could find out what was going on after making a few phone calls. Although these reporters were here for the meeting between Eric Williams, Warren Buffett, and other big shots, they were still there. However, while they were waiting, the reporters were not stingy with their film. Every time a Hollywood star appeared outside the hotel, there would be a flash of magnesium light. Therefore, most of the celebrities who came to attend the party were in high spirits, especially those small and third-tier celebrities who lacked exposure. They all slowed down and tried to let the reporters take a few more photos. Soon it was 7 o'clock in the evening. The sky in Los Angeles in March was completely dark. The banquet hall booked by ICM was already crowded with Hollywood superstars and celebrities. Everyone was in small groups of 2s and 3s, discussing what was going to happen tonight. I thought the negotiations had really broken down. I sold all my ABC shares a few days ago. I might have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars this time. A chubby white man with a glass of champagne in his hand said this to his companions. His tone was relaxed, as if he didn't care about the loss of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The girl who was leaning against him heard the fat man's words. She couldn't help but look around and rub against him again. Another middle-aged man in a white suit glanced at the petite girl leaning against his companion and said proudly, "I bought 3,000 shares yesterday at a low price. If Eric Williams and Warren Buffett can reach an agreement tonight, I might be able to exchange it for Firefly Pictures shares in the future." Another tall middle-aged man quickly said, "It's not that easy to get Firefly shares. I heard that the main difference between Firefly and ABC is the share exchange. Eric Williams is only willing to give up a small portion of Firefly shares. There aren't many ABC shares in the market now. If the acquisition is completed, most of the shares may be required to be exchanged for cash or bonds in order to achieve privatization. Otherwise, it's impossible to reach the minimum number of shareholders to be delisted from the exchange." The petite girl leaning next to the fat man said in a curious tone, "What if these shareholders don't want to?" The tall middle-aged man smiled and said, "If you insist on not selling, then the shares in your hands may be placed in a package holding company by Firefly. But this is not cost-effective, because the market value of the company is difficult to determine after privatization. The value of the shares in your hands tends to shrink significantly. In addition, those shares don't bring you any right to speak, so as long as you are smart, you will choose to cash them out." The guests were chatting in a low voice. There was a small commotion in the banquet hall. As the host of tonight's party, Kapoor Sid hurried out through the crowd. People realized that the most important guest of tonight was about to arrive. Although there were many outsiders in the banquet hall tonight, most of them were still stars, agents, and other film and television workers in the Hollywood circle. Although they had heard of Buffett's deeds, they were still more concerned about Eric, the young Hollywood tycoon with the halo of the richest man on his head. Many people cheered up. Some actresses even deliberately went to the corner to check their makeup, hoping to leave a good impression in front of Eric Williams. At the same time, because the driver did not expect so many reporters to gather outside the party in advance, he drove directly to the entrance of the hotel. So the two cars Eric and Katzenberg were in were surrounded by reporters. It was not until Kapoor appeared with a large group of security guards and tried to push the crowd away that Eric was able to get out of the car. Outside the human wall formed by the security guards, when the reporters saw Eric, Katzenberg, and other Firefly executives get out of the car, they suddenly went crazy. They took photos and shouted questions at Eric. They walked to the entrance of the hotel. Just when the reporters thought that these big shots would disappear without a word, Eric stood on the steps and stopped. He pressed his hands to signal the crowd to be quiet before he said, "About tonight's matter, I will hold a press conference after the party, but it is not convenient to disclose anything now. Everyone wait patiently." Is there really going to be a showdown tonight? As soon as Eric's voice fell, a reporter asked in a hurried tone. He didn't even have time to add any title. The reporters who were about to open their mouths all quieted down when they heard the question that hit the nail on the head. Eric had a faint smile on his face. He nodded without a trace, but he did not answer directly. He said, "I don't think Mr. Buffett came here because he appreciates a Hollywood star." After saying this, Eric did not give the reporters a chance to ask any more questions. He turned around and walked toward the hotel lobby. Eric led Katzenberg and the others into the elevator with Kapoor. As soon as they appeared at the banquet, the crowd in the hall seemed to have felt a magnetic force and gathered toward the door. All kinds of greetings floated around Eric, Katzenberg, and the others. Although most of the women's agency contracts were with ICM, Eric did not see any other women in the crowd tonight except for Penelope. Even the girls who liked to attend parties did not join in the fun. Penelope only used her eyes to greet Eric before continuing to stay with the other two girls from Breakin' Beauties. Although the clever Spanish girl didn't know the specific situation, she clearly realized that Eric had something important to do tonight. The current ICM could be said to be strong and powerful. James Cameron, Quentin Tarantino, Tom Hanks, Al Pacino, Julia Roberts, and a large number of other first-tier directors and actors were gathered under ICM. Their overall strength was not much worse than CAA, which had been in the limelight a few years ago. Since the founder, Marvin Joseph, gradually withdrew, Kapoor relied on the company's shares and his personal relationship with Eric to smoothly become the head of ICM. Eric spent more than 10 minutes greeting his acquaintances one by one before going to a reception room with Kapoor and the others. Buffett wasn't late today. Just as Eric chatted with everyone, Kapoor was notified that Buffett and the others had arrived. Kapoor led the security guards to rescue the three old men, who were also trapped in the car. Eric, Katzenberg, and the others who were standing in the hotel lobby, greeted them. After Buffett shook hands with the others, he said to Eric, "Eric, we meet again." "Yeah, I've been looking forward to meeting you again," Eric said with a smile. Buffett shook hands with Eric and then introduced, "These two are Tom Murphy and Charlie Munger." "Hello." Eric walked up to them with a smile on his face and complimented them again. The group didn't go to the banquet hall. Instead, they went directly to a small conference room prepared by the hotel. After the waiter served the coffee and left the conference room, Kapoor nodded to Eric and left. Only the senior executives of Firefly and ABC were left in the conference room. Katzenberg, Jeffrey Michael Lynn, and Frank Wales sat on either side of Eric. Opposite them were Buffett and the others. After chatting for a while, Buffett finally said, "Eric, I think that if this matter continues to be delayed, it won't be good for anyone, so I think it's better for us to be honest. What do you think?" Eric nodded with a smile and didn't refute, but he believed that everyone present knew very well that Firefly had the upper hand at this time. Even a large portion of ABC's shareholders had publicly stood on Firefly's side a few days ago. If it wasn't to avoid internal turmoil in ABC, Eric could even cooperate with ABC's shareholders who were inclined towards Firefly and quickly take control of ABC. Mr. Buffett, I don't want to waste too much time on this kind of thing. Everyone knows very well that Firefly doesn't only have ABC as a choice. Before Buffett could speak, Tom Murphy, who was sitting next to him, couldn't help but say, "Everyone knows why you chose ABC. Among the 3 major TV stations, ABC is now in the best operating condition. Our TV network is the most complete in the United States, and we have the most affiliated TV stations. If you choose any of the other 2, it will take at least 3 years to catch up with ABC. Of course, I even think that because of the complicated internal problems, you may not even have the chance to catch up." Although Fox Network had been rising for several years, Tom Murphy was still used to the title of the 3 major TV networks. Eric shook his head and smiled. "Mr. Murphy, what you said is just your personal assumption. I think a few years ago, many people assumed that Firefly Pictures had no possibility of joining the Big 7, but now this has become a fact. Moreover, judging from the ratings of Fox's Friends, The X-Files, and Who Will Be a Millionaire, I think your assumption is no longer valid." Because of the defection of ABC's internal shareholders and the stalemate in the negotiations with Firefly Pictures, Tom Murphy had been in a bad mood for the past week. When he heard Eric's words, Tom Murphy's face suddenly became a little embarrassed. When he was about to refute, Charlie Munger, who was sitting on the other side, asked with great interest, "So Mr. Williams, why do you insist on buying ABC instead of choosing the other 2 networks? I think choosing either NBC or CBS can save you a lot of money." Eric smiled and said, "As Mr. Murphy said, ABC is the one with the best conditions among the 3. Oh, it should be the 4 major TV networks." Charlie Munger continued to ask, "This doesn't seem to be a reason, right?" "This is the reason. Of course, the main reason is that I don't want to spend too much energy on tinkering with NBC or CBS after acquiring the 2 networks. I still have more things to do." Oh, Charlie Munger was even more curious. After completing the acquisition of the TV networks, Firefly will be the largest comprehensive media group in the United States and even the world. According to the federal anti-monopoly law, it is almost impossible for Firefly to continue to expand at that time. "What else do you want to do?" Eric said, "I don't think this is the topic we want to discuss today, right?" Charlie Munger also suddenly realized that he was about to lead the topic astray. He noticed the look in his old friend's eyes and coughed to cover it up, but he still said with some reluctance, "I'm really curious about the minds of young people nowadays. If possible, why don't we take some time to have a casual chat?" Eric nodded and said with a smile, "Of course, Mr. Munger. If you have time, you can call me at any time." Buffett didn't want to refute his old friend. After the 2 of them finished talking, he took out a notebook from his pocket and handed it to Eric, saying, "Eric, this is the last concession I can make. You can take a look first." Eric took the small notebook, gestured to the left and right, and spread it on the table. Katzenberg and Michael Lynn came over to look at the notebook, while Jeffrey and Frank Wales were too embarrassed to come over. Buffett's offer was not much different from the last offer he received, but he made a concession in terms of the shares he already held in Firefly Pictures. Firefly could add their shares to the 30% share exchange ratio. After the last offer, in order to suppress ABC's share price, Firefly sold 3 million shares, and their stake was reduced to 5%. In simple terms, Buffett had reduced the share exchange ratio to 28.4%. According to the market value of $30 billion after the merger, each percentage point was equivalent to a difference of $300 million. The amount involved in the future would be even greater, so of course, Eric wouldn't easily back down. After quickly writing a series of numbers, Eric handed the notebook to Buffett and said, "Mr. Buffett, this is our proposal." Chapter 594. Seeing the 3 old men frown at the same time after seeing the data on the notepad, Eric explained unhurriedly, "Firefly still insists that they can only sell 25% of Firefly shares at most. However, because ABC and Firefly are both registered in Delaware, they are not willing to sell the shares. According to the General Company Law of Delaware, as long as the parent company obtains more than 90% of the shares of the subsidiary company, the board of directors of the parent company can unilaterally propose to privatize the remaining shares. The form of privatization is decided by the parent company, and there is no need to consult the board of directors and investors of the subsidiary company. So, if ABC can cooperate with Firefly to acquire 90% of the shares in advance, we can buy the remaining 10% of the shares in cash. The remaining shareholders don't have to participate in the exchange of 25% of the shares. Berkshire Hathaway and Mr. Murphy's company will get no less than the plan proposed by Mr. Buffett. The tax in the United States was divided into federal tax and state tax, but the percentage of state tax varied greatly from state to state. Because of Delaware's special tax exemption policy, many companies in the United States would choose to register in Delaware. As a well-known lawyer, Charlie Munger saw some of the problems at a glance. But Eric, haven't you thought about it? This plan is still likely to lead to an investigation by the SEC. Although Eric's plan was not illegal, it still crossed the line. As the world's most mature bond market, in order to ensure the healthy development of the securities market, the United States protected the interests of small shareholders much more than the major shareholders. Eric's plan at this time was suspected of making ordinary shareholders lose their freedom of choice. Once this plan caused the small shareholders to be dissatisfied and initiate a lawsuit, Firefly would still be in controversy. Eric did not avoid Charlie Munger's gaze and said, "I've consulted the company's lawyer. This is not illegal." Similarly, the interests of ordinary shareholders will not be harmed. Firefly will still buy the shares in their hands at a price 50% higher than the stock price. While the two were talking, Buffett couldn't help but think of the decline of Salomon Brothers 4 years ago. Whenever he thought of this incident, Buffett would feel a lingering fear in his heart. What destroyed Salomon Brothers was not just the false bidding case, but the long litigation and credit crisis brought about by the false bidding case. Before the Salomon Brothers incident, in Buffett's nearly 60 years of life, the number of times he appeared in court could be counted on one hand, and the number of times he was sued was even fewer. Compared to other investors who were always in disputes, this could be regarded as a record. Now, even though Buffett knew that accepting Eric's proposal would maximize Berkshire Hathaway's benefits, it would bring unnecessary legal risks to both parties. This risk had already crossed Buffett's bottom line. "Eric, I don't agree with your proposal." Eric was a little surprised, but Charlie Munger and Tom Murphy, who were very familiar with Buffett, did not look surprised at all. They knew very well that Buffett was actually a somewhat overly cautious person. After Buffett finished speaking, the conference room fell silent. However, everyone else also realized the implication of Buffett's last sentence. Buffett disagreed with Eric's proposal, but it did not mean that he rejected the deal. Therefore, everyone waited for him to continue. Although Buffett still remained calm on the surface, he was very conflicted. Even the Salomon Brothers' predicament a few years ago did not make him so difficult to advance or retreat. If he had absolute control of ABC, although he was very tempted to cooperate with Firefly, he would probably have rejected the deal long ago. Because he was not a person who was good at bargaining. When he felt that something was out of control, Buffett would usually decisively stop the matter in order not to let himself continue to waste energy. It was the same when investing in companies. For companies that he could not control, Buffett would usually not be entangled, and would sell his shares. The situation in ABC was now out of his control. Even the influence he had accumulated in the investment world for decades had lost its effect, because the rise of Firefly was more legendary than his personal history. Except for him and his old friends who still insisted, many major shareholders of ABC had already sided with Firefly. Buffett knew very well that if they did not reach an agreement tonight, then with the secret support of Firefly, the group of ABC shareholders who had sided with Firefly Pictures would facilitate the deal by sponsoring an interim shareholders meeting. Once the deal was facilitated in the hands of other shareholders, then just like Eric's proposal to abandon 10% of the small shareholders, they could also draw up other plans to plunder the interests of Berkshire Hathaway and Tom Murphy. In the end, even if their economic interests were guaranteed, they would completely lose their influence on ABC and the company after the merger in the future. And once the deal failed, the consequences would be even more unpredictable. The size of the audience in the United States was fixed. The reason why ABC was able to get the #1 TV market share in North America in recent years, in addition to its own stable operating conditions, was mainly because the other two competitors, NBC and CBS, were in a slump. Regardless of whether Firefly took over NBC or CBS in the future, with Firefly's strong content production advantage, it would pose a huge threat to ABC's position. General Electric had absolute control of NBC, but the management still made the company turbulent with the support of other shareholders. If ABC's performance began to decline because of this, the shareholders who were already dissatisfied with them would definitely make more trouble, which would affect the operation of the network and create a vicious cycle. The conference room was silent for 5 minutes. Everyone was patiently waiting for Buffett to make the final decision. Finally, after a sigh, Buffett said softly, "I will probably regret today's decision in the future." When this sentence sounded in the conference room, everyone realized that Buffett had made a decision. Eric had a confident smile on his face as he said, "Warren, I promise you that you will not regret your decision today." Buffett did not react too much to Eric's words. However, since he had made a decision in his heart, Buffett did not continue to dwell on the details. He simply agreed to the transaction plan of 25% of Firefly's shares and $10 billion in cash. After a simple glass of champagne to celebrate, Buffett and the other two declined Eric's invitation and left the Sunset Tower Hotel by car. In the underground parking lot, Eric watched Buffett and the other two leave. He turned around and smiled at Carson. "Jeffrey, you will host the next press conference." Carson knew that after completing the acquisition of ABC, his career would take another big step forward, so he said excitedly, "Eric, should we hold a high-level meeting now to make preparations?" Eric tapped his watch and said, "You have to be considerate of other people's feelings. It's the weekend, not to mention it's already 8:30 p.m. "Okay, tomorrow then." Carson did not seem to realize that tomorrow was Sunday, but Eric did not stop him. Well, the executives would not scold him anyway. Carson hurriedly left to deal with the reporters who had been waiting for a long time. Eric, Jeffrey, and the other two chatted and laughed as they returned to the party. The news that Eric asked someone to send champagne to the conference room had spread throughout the party. The guests had already guessed the result of the matter. When they saw Eric appear, everyone crowded around to congratulate him. Although the final negotiation did not take long, Eric's mood was tense throughout the process. Buffett did not want this deal to fail, and neither did Eric. Otherwise, a lot of work done by Firefly would be for naught, and everything would have to start from scratch. At this time, he suddenly relaxed and felt tired. After a simple social interaction with everyone, Eric sat down on the sofa in the corner of the hall. Penelope deliberately walked past him with Kate Beckinsale and Charlize Theron. Eric smiled and patted the sofa next to him. Penelope walked over without hesitation and sat down next to Eric with a smile. Seeing Eric sitting in the middle of the sofa without any intention of moving, the other two girls looked at each other. Finally, Charlize took the initiative to walk forward and sit on Eric's left. Kate also sat down next to Charlize. Penelope did not pay attention to these small details. She leaned slightly on Eric and said excitedly, "Eric, Kate and I went to try on a dress today. It's very beautiful. Do you want to see it in advance?" Eric was a little confused and asked, "An Oscar dress?" Penelope nodded. "Before I came to the United States, I filmed Beautiful Times and it was nominated for Best Foreign Language Film. I received an Oscar invitation." Eric then understood that the promotion of the Break-In Doll had already begun. This should be the work done by MGM to promote the Break-In Doll. Since Penelope was going to attend the Oscars because of Beautiful Times, Kate must have been nominated for the Shakespeare comedy Much Ado About Nothing. In Eric's memory, this movie did not win any Oscars in the original space-time. It seemed that MGM had done a lot of work for the Break-In Doll. However, at this time, the two helmers of MGM, one used to be an executive of Paramount, and the other used to be the head of production of Warner Pictures. With the connections they had accumulated over the years, it was not difficult for them to arrange for an insignificant nomination for Much Ado About Nothing. Then, they could legitimately make Kate appear at the Oscars. Thinking of this, Eric turned his head and asked Kate curiously, "What nominations did Much Ado About Nothing get?" "Best Costume and Best Soundtrack," Kate said, a little embarrassed. Although she had just arrived in Hollywood, she knew that this time, she was attending the Oscars completely. Eric remembered the situation when he attended the Golden Globe Awards in January and smiled. These 2 nominations are just right. If it was like the Golden Globe Awards, where there were no major awards but only a nomination for Best Picture, then it would be worthy of the name. Listening to the 3 of them talking about the Oscars, Charlie's eyes flashed with a touch of disappointment. Although they had moved out of the apartment that the 3 of them shared, Penelope still maintained a good relationship with the 2 girls according to Eric's request. Although Charlie quickly picked up a glass of red wine to hide his expression, Penelope still noticed the change in Charlie's expression. So she said to Eric, "Eric, why don't you help Charlie get an Oscar invitation too? I think this will be a piece of cake for you." Eric looked at Charlie, who was obviously looking forward to it but still maintaining a reserved expression, and said, "There's no need. When next year, the 3 of you can attend the award ceremony together. Maybe you can even be the guest presenter at the same time." Hearing Eric's refusal, Penelope did not say anything more, but Charlie lowered his head slightly in disappointment. Kate's bright eyes darted between Eric and Charles, and she raised her eyebrows without anyone noticing. She felt that Eric was definitely doing this on purpose. Eric just happened to notice the slight change in Kate's expression, but he did not mind that she saw through it. He still had a smile on his face and suddenly asked Kate, "Have you been smoking recently?" Kate was stunned and immediately shook his head. No. Eric dragged his voice. "Looks like you have." Kate also realized that her guilty conscience was too obvious, so she quickly said, "If you want to deduct my pay, then deduct mine." Eric smiled and said, "Actually, you can also pay them privately." Kate stared at Eric's faint smile and realized that Eric did not mean to take it seriously, so she went along with Eric's tone and said, "Okay, then punish them. I'll compensate them privately." Eric shrugged slightly, leaned back on the sofa, and took a sip of red wine. He waved his hand and said, "You guys go play, I'm going to rest for a while." Maybe it was because he relaxed, but when Kate heard Eric's words he said, "You sound like an old man." "Oh." Eric nodded and said, "Penny, Charlie, you guys go play. Kate, stay with this old man for a while. Charlie, let's go dance." Penelope got up and held Charlie's arm. She smiled and walked towards the dance floor. Eric looked at Kate, who was sitting in his original position, and patted Charlie's seat. He said, "Come here." Kate moved in the opposite direction and said, I was just joking. This is a public place, you can't mess around." "If that's the case, what are you afraid of? Come here." Kate's attitude was very firm. "I'm not going over." Chapter 595. The 2 bickered childishly for a while. Eric looked at Kate's little hand grabbing the armrest of the sofa, as if she was going to get up and run away as soon as he made a move. He couldn't help but smile and did not continue. He sipped the red wine in his hand, and began to think about the next few days. With Buffett and Tom Murphy, plus other shareholders who had already turned to his side, there would be no obstacles to Firefly's acquisition of ABC. However, all this was actually just the beginning. Compared with Firefly's acquisition of Disney, this acquisition of ABC was much more cumbersome. Back then, Firefly and Disney were both film companies. Although there were some areas where their departments and resources overlapped, Firefly was still very weak compared to Disney. After the 2 merged, they did not need to make too many adjustments. This time, the situation was different. Although ABC and Firefly were 2 different companies, they both belonged to the media industry. Moreover, both companies were giants in the industry. Once they merged, they would definitely need to undergo a long adjustment that would take at least a few months or even a few years. Moreover, these were all matters after the completion of the merger. Before that, in order to pay for the cash portion of this acquisition, Firefly needed to issue about $8 billion of long-term bonds in addition to its own cash accumulation of more than $2 billion. Such a huge amount of debt financing was definitely not something that could be done overnight. Although Firefly's strong profitability had proved that it had enough strength to repay the debt, it still might encounter various problems in the financing process. Thinking of this, although he knew it was impossible, Eric couldn't help but sigh in his heart. If only he could have another opportunity like the Gulf War. A woman's mind was always difficult to understand. Kate, who was sitting on the other side of the sofa, saw that Eric no longer paid attention to her. She hesitated for a moment, then took the initiative to sit over. "Hey, what are you thinking about?" Kate asked when she saw Eric frowning slightly. At the same time, her heart couldn't help but beat a few times. She couldn't help but think that this man's look was quite charming when he was lost in thought. Eric came back to his senses, looked at Kate and smiled. "You won't be interested." "How do you know I'm not interested if you don't say it?" Kate curled her lips with some dissatisfaction, then looked up and asked, "Eric, are you really the richest man in the United States now?" "If no one richer than me jumps out," Eric spread his hands and said with a smile, "then that person should be me." Kate suddenly looked eager and asked, "How does it feel to be the richest man in the United States?" Eric suddenly said in a serene tone, "It's like a dream. I hope I never wake up." Huh? Kate was startled by Eric's sudden change in mood and laughed. The two were silent for a while before Kate suddenly asked in a gossipy whisper, "Why did you do that to Charlie?" Eric winked at Kate. "What do you think?" Kate suddenly felt that she had unknowingly leaned against Eric. Their eyes met at such a close distance that she couldn't help but shrink her neck. She then put on a disdainful look and said, "Anyway, you definitely don't have any good intentions." Eric chased after Kate's small body until the distance between them was less than 10 centimeters. He then asked in a somewhat playful tone, "Then tell me, what do I think of you?" Kate felt a buzzing sound in her head, as if she had lost all ability to think for a moment. She supported herself with one hand on the leather sofa cushion behind her and leaned back. She watched the handsome face that was not much older than her come closer, until she felt a quick peck on her lips. She instantly woke up and moved to the other side in a panic. She looked at the guests in the hall at a loss. Obviously, a lot of people had noticed the scene just now. However, when her eyes swept over them, they all turned their heads away as if nothing had happened. Eric looked at Kate, who looked like a frightened little animal, and said with a smile, "See, one of the benefits of being the richest man in the United States is that when people clearly notice what you are doing, they will consciously pretend not to see it." After a little panic, anger, and grievance, Kate suddenly felt that she couldn't just be kissed like that. Even the feeling, she didn't want to feel anything. Looking at Eric's hateful smile, driven by unwillingness, Kate suddenly jumped on Eric, surprising all the guests who were secretly watching them. She held Eric's head with her two small hands and kissed him fiercely. Kate clumsily nibbled on Eric's lips for a while before straightening up. She proudly raised her chin and made an expression that said, "It's just SOSO." However, when Kate wanted to leave Eric's body, she felt a pair of big hands tightly grab her waist. Eric held Kate's slender waist and said with a smile, "You want to leave after kissing me without taking responsibility? There's no such thing as easy." Kate struggled a few times, and when he heard the whispers behind him, he immediately realized that he had lost his composure. However, since things had developed to this extent, it was impossible for him to redeem himself. Although he was very regretful, Kite still forced himself to show a stubborn expression and bargained, What do you want?" At this time, she had completely forgotten that it was Eric who made the first move. Oh, it was his mouth. "There are a lot of people here. Why don't we find a place to talk in detail?" "Okay," Kate said with an "I'm not afraid of you" look, "then let me go first." "No need to be so troublesome," Eric said as he stood up from the sofa. He slightly changed his posture and held Kate in his arms. He ignored the gazes of the other people and strode outside. Kate, who buried her face in Eric's chest, cried in her heart, "It's over. How am I going to face people now?" Kate stood up from the large jacuzzi tub and stood in front of the dressing mirror. She wiped her body with a towel and thought about everything that had happened in the past few hours. She suddenly felt that it was unreal. Although Eric was a bit overbearing, she realized that she didn't dislike him at all. Instead, she felt that it was natural. This was because when Penelope occasionally chatted, she inadvertently revealed that although Eric looked gentle on the surface, he was actually a very overbearing person. Moreover, although she never said anything on the surface, and it wasn't easy for others to see through her expression like Charlie, it was impossible to say that she didn't envy Penelope. After dawdling for a while, she walked out of the room and saw Eric, who had already showered and changed into his pajamas, lying on the bed and casually flipping through a magazine. No matter what kind of personality a woman had, in front of a man who had just had sex with her, she would often act like a little bird. Kate quietly walked barefoot across the wooden floor of the bedroom, and quietly walked to the side of the bed beside Eric. She suddenly smiled and said, "Now Charlie feels even more uncomfortable in her heart." Eric's gaze was still on the magazine as he casually said, "I didn't expect you to still think of your good sister under such circumstances." Kate also felt that her thoughts were a bit jumpy. She smiled and raised her face to ask, "You still haven't told me. Why did you deliberately give Charlie the cold shoulder?" Eric pretended to think for a moment and then said, "I don't know, I just wanted to do it for no reason. You know, a big shot like me is always a bit temperamental." Kate hit Eric and said, "You're really despicable." Eric didn't dodge and said with a smile, "You know, when a woman says this kind of thing, I usually listen to it the opposite way." Kate also laughed a few times for no reason, but soon fell silent again. She suddenly said, "Hey, will you buy a house and raise me like you did with Penny?" Eric put down the magazine in his hand and asked, "Do you want it?" Kate didn't hide her true thoughts. "It would be great if I could just have a house. Penny's villa near the sea is really beautiful." Eric stretched out his hand and pinched the girl's small chin and said with a smile, "Oh, then you're greedy enough. You don't want to pay, but only want to get." Kate shrunk her neck a little embarrassedly, but didn't mention this topic again and asked, "Hey, you have so many women around you, is there any that you really like? Don't you think this topic is inappropriate? I'm curious, tell me. It doesn't matter if I like or not, I just want to possess." Eric said as he stared into Kate's eyes and said, "So from today onwards, be my woman and don't think about running away." Kate shrunk her neck a little in dissatisfaction, and her voice trembled slightly, like a small beast trapped in a trap. She weakly resisted. "You can't do this." Eric reached out to turn off the table lamp, pulled up the quilt and said to Kate, "Okay, go to sleep." The sudden darkness in the room made Kate inexplicably calm down. She felt that Eric might just be joking, so her heart relaxed even more. After a while, Kate pulled off the bathrobe on her body and gently leaned against Eric. After some time, Kate's voice came from the bedroom again. "Hey, are you asleep? Soon, if you have any questions, ask them tomorrow. I suddenly realized that you have a lot of questions." Kate chuckled and said unrelentingly, "Last question." "Say it." That, although it was covered by the darkness, Kate still seemed a little embarrassed. "How do you feel when you're with Penny and her sister?" After a short silence, there was a slight rustling sound in the bedroom, and then Kate exclaimed in a small voice, "Ah, why are you here again? You asked for it." Chapter 596. Early the next morning, all the mainstream newspapers in the United States reported that Eric and Buffett had met again and reached a preliminary merger agreement. Because it was the weekend edition, the Los Angeles Times even used a large section to report on Firefly last year. Eric was eating breakfast and reading the newspaper when he heard a slight noise coming from the dining room door. Turning around, Kate appeared at the entrance of the restaurant wearing only a large white men's shirt. Eric realized that the women didn't find his clothes to wear without him teaching them. It was mainly because they often wore formal gowns before spending the night at the Pointy Corner Manor. Evening gowns could show off a woman's charm, but it wasn't very comfortable to wear them on a daily basis. Therefore, the women would often find his clothes to wear after waking up. Kate noticed that Eric was staring at her long legs under her shirt. She subconsciously slowed down to hide her unusual pace. Kate didn't breathe a sigh of relief until she sat down at the dining table. Thinking about how Eric had tortured her last night, Kate's heart burned with anger. However, she quickly remembered what happened at the party last night. When she saw the newspaper in Eric's hand, she became a little nervous. "Eric, is there anything about what happened last night in the newspaper?" Eric knew what Kate was referring to. He smiled mischievously and replied, "Yes, it's all the headlines." Kate's heart tightened. She quickly grabbed the newspaper beside Eric and flipped through a few pages. She didn't see any news about the two of them being intimate at the party last night. Only then did she breathe a sigh of relief. Then, she glared at Eric. Eric got up and walked to the kitchen. He brought the breakfast he had left for Kate and handed it to her. He said, "Don't worry. There's no photographic evidence of what happened last night. No mainstream media will report it. Even if the third-rate tabloids hear the news and want to make groundless accusations, they'll have to consider the consequences. At most, it will only circulate in the circle." Kate had just relaxed and was about to eat a piece of bread when she heard Eric's last sentence. She raised her head and said, "So many people know about it. They'll definitely talk about it in private. Let's think about it from another perspective." Eric sat down on the chair again, picked up the newspaper and continued, "This matter won't do you any harm, right? Of course, there was no harm in having such a big backer like Eric. Instead, it would make her acting career reach a higher level." However, after pondering for a while, Kite still felt that something was off. However, Kite didn't have the intention to get to the bottom of things that he couldn't figure out at the moment. Plus, he had too much exercise last night, so the famished Kite quickly put these thoughts aside and focused on eating breakfast. Eric noticed the change in Kite's expression from the corner of his eye, and the smile on his lips deepened. If the news got out, it wouldn't cause any damage to Kate's reputation and career. After all, although he was at the top of the Hollywood pyramid, Eric wasn't one of those old men in their 50s or 60s. He was about the same age as Kate. If people knew about their relationship, most people would only envy Kate. However, this matter would definitely have some impact. The most important point was that after knowing the relationship between Eric and Kate, there wouldn't be many men who dared to take the initiative to provoke Kate. Kate smeared jam on the bread and inadvertently looked up. She happened to see the smile on Eric's face. The woman's keen sixth sense made her realize that this expression must have something to do with her. She asked vigilantly, "What bad ideas are you having?" Eric smiled and said, "You said it's a bad idea. When have you ever seen a villain with a normal IQ take the initiative to reveal his thoughts?" Kate snorted softly and sped up her eating speed. Soon, she finished the breakfast in front of her. She looked at the empty tableware in front of her and Eric. She hesitated for a moment, then got up and took the initiative to clean up. When she returned to the dining room again, Kate saw that Eric had already opened the laptop that had just been put aside and was looking at something. She sat down in the seat just now. Seeing that Eric didn't take the initiative to talk to her, Kate picked up the newspaper and casually flipped through it. She saw an article that the FCC might conduct an antitrust investigation on the merger of Firefly and ABC. The writer's tone was very sensational, and it was completely a tone that said Firefly and ABC couldn't be merged smoothly. Kate was gloating at first, but then she felt that she shouldn't be like this. So she reached out and gently touched Eric and handed over the page of the newspaper. "Eric, is what it says true?" Eric glanced at it. He had just read it and said, "It's true and it's not true. Don't always be so perfunctory, it's too ungentlemanly." "Well, since you want to know," Eric waved to Kate and asked her to sit next to him, and said, "You see, this article says that the biggest obstacle to Firefly's acquisition of ABC is within ABC. But the biggest internal obstacle, Warren Buffett and Tom Murphy, have already agreed to this deal. The two of them control 40% of ABC's shares. Coupled with other shareholders who have turned to Firefly, the shareholders who are inclined to the merger hold far more than 51% of the shares. This is no longer true." After listening to Eric, Kate suddenly felt that she really didn't seem to be interested in these things. However, since she started this topic, Kate had to point to the content of the article and asked, "What about this, the FCC's antitrust investigation?" The definition of monopoly in the federal antitrust law is often very vague. 90% of industry giants will have some monopolistic behavior when they develop to a certain extent. This is inevitable. As long as no one pursues it, the functional departments of the government rarely take the initiative to find trouble. Most of the investigations of antitrust cases are actually initiated by peer companies in order to suppress competitors, but this also requires a lot of funding and connections. If you want to file a lawsuit, Firefly is definitely not short of funds. As for connections, in order to cultivate the company's spokesperson, Firefly now spends more than $5 million a year on paid consultants and official donations. The same is true for ABC. Moreover, the merger of Firefly and ABC does not violate the federal antitrust law. Even if someone jumps out to stop it, it can only play the role of delaying some time. You can't get any benefits, and you have to make two powerful enemies at once. I don't think anyone is willing to do this kind of thing where the loss outweighs the gain. Kate nodded slightly. She didn't know if she should continue this topic. There was a beeping sound from the laptop next to her, which sounded like the ringtone of a pager. Eric also looked over with some surprise, and found that a dialogue window had appeared on the computer screen. Then a line of words quickly popped up in the dialogue window. "This is the beta version. I helped you install it. How about you try it?" Staring at the name Steve in the dialogue box for half a second, Eric was first a little happy that Steve Mitnick had finally created the instant messaging software. Then he cursed inwardly. "You actually hacked into my computer. Don't you think that's very impolite?" He quickly typed a reply. "You actually hacked into my computer. Don't you think this is very impolite?" "Oh, sorry. I just think it's more convenient to help you install it this way." Eric didn't hear any apology in this sentence. He helplessly held the mouse and began to check the various functions of the software. After proposing the idea of the instant messaging software, Eric successively passed some of the information in his memory to the other party. At this time, although the interface of the instant messaging software was a bit simple, the software functions were relatively good. There were account levels, user information settings, simple emoticons, email connections, and chat groups, and it ran very smoothly. Although Steve Mitnick was a procrastinator, his technical skills were definitely top-notch. Kate had been curiously watching the conversation between Eric and Steve Mitnick. Seeing that Eric was checking the software, she asked curiously, "What is this?" "It's a chatting software," Eric replied. "With this, you can chat with friends who are in different places through the internet." Oh. Kate's interest was immediately piqued. She curiously reached out her small hand and typed the word, "hello" on the keyboard. She imitated Eric's behavior and pressed the enter key. Then, like a child who had seen an interesting toy, she stared at the word she typed in the window with some joy, as if she was waiting for a response. Steve Mitnick quickly replied, "What does this mean?" Eric typed back, "My woman is greeting you." Kate was just about to protest the way Eric addressed her when the other party said, "Oh, I heard you have quite a lot of women." Eric quickly grabbed the small hand that was reaching for his waist and patted it comfortingly. He complained inwardly, "Do you know how to speak? Why don't you take note of the situation?" Indeed, it turned out that the person on the other end of the internet with severe procrastination had emotional intelligence. "Sorry, this sentence seems inappropriate. Your woman isn't angry, is she?" Kate pulled her hand back and rolled her eyes at Eric. Then she clumsily typed on the keyboard and sent, "I'm very angry." The other party was silent for a while before replying, "I'm very sorry." Eric didn't want the two of them to continue their meaningless conversation. He snatched control of the keyboard and quickly communicated with Steve Mitnick with his fingertips. "Since the software has been created, let's quickly come up with a marketing plan. Also, I'll send you some of my ideas from time to time. This is only a beta version. I think it's better to launch it publicly in June. Are there any other problems?" "There are many problems. Although it has been perfected many times, there are still many bugs. I found that I have at least a dozen ways to crack the encryption system of this software. I can't think of a single way, so don't think of others as perverts like you. There are still more normal people in this world. I'm not a pervert. I'm not going to argue with you about this. Come up with a marketing plan within a month. Also, don't forget to register the patent. As for the bugs you mentioned, they can be slowly fixed in the future. There is no such thing as a 100% perfect software in the world. Okay, Steve Mitnick agreed. I'll get them to come up with a marketing plan first. Also, you said that you would come to Boston for a chat. When are you coming? Eric said. Have you been following the news? Yes, it seems like you attended the Golden Globe Awards ceremony. I just happened to see it. That was more than a month ago. Eric was speechless. I'm very busy now. Maybe I'll be free next month. Then next month it is, the other party replied and quickly said, Oh, I just glanced at the Yahoo homepage. I know what you're busy with. After ending the conversation with Steve Mitnick, Eric opened his email and looked at it. Alan had already sent his schedule. My flight is at 3 in the afternoon. Eric pointed to the form on the screen and said to Kate, I seem to have something on today too, Kate said as she stood up subconsciously. Eric shook his head and pulled Kate over to sit down again. He smiled and said, You can't even walk properly. What else do you have to do? Kate blushed and punched Eric. It's all your fault. Of course, I'm not denying this. Eric smiled and said, Last night, you said you wanted a beautiful beach villa. Why don't I get them to send over some housing information so you can pick? No. Kate refused without hesitation. I'll go back and live with Charlie. Eric nodded and said, Okay, that's it. Kate was stunned. She thought Eric would definitely persuade her. She didn't expect this man to skip over this matter so easily. She suddenly felt a little disappointed, but fortunately, she didn't show it on her face. The two stayed in the villa for the whole morning. In the afternoon, Eric left Kate in the villa to recuperate and took a plane to New York. After Buffett and Tom Murphy compromised, there were no more obstacles to the ABC acquisition. Therefore, the ABC Board of Directors passed the transaction plan the next day. In the previous negotiation process, the two sides had reached a detailed agreement on many details. Therefore, after the transaction plan was passed, there were no internal problems between ABC and Firefly. Both sides submitted an application to the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, together. Because a lot of preparation work was done in advance, the FCC quickly approved the transaction between the two sides. However, Firefly needed to divest some of the television business that originally belonged to Disney. Chapter 597. Out of concern of hindering media freedom, the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, limited the number of media outlets a media company could have in the same area. In the early days, the FCC even stipulated that a television network could not have more than 2 public television stations in the same area at the same time. However, these restrictions had been relaxed with the development of time and the promotion of capital forces. Otherwise, the phenomenon of several major media companies monopolizing news channels in North America would not have occurred. However, at this time, the FCC's restrictions were still relatively strict. ABC's television network covered the entire United States. In order to pass the FCC's review, Firefly had to promise to divest a public youth television station in Los Angeles that it acquired when it acquired Disney. After these issues were resolved, the merger between Firefly and ABC was quickly reviewed by the FCC. While accepting the FCC's review, Firefly began a large-scale debt financing plan. Firefly had achieved high profits in the past 2 years, but in order to ensure the company's sufficient cash flow, Eric only planned to withdraw $2 billion in cash from the company for this acquisition. The remaining $8 billion would be raised through the issuance of bonds. Firefly and the future ABC television network after the merger both had a large number of excellent assets. Coupled with the stable operating conditions and profit expectations of the two companies, no one doubted Firefly's solvency in the future. Credit rating agencies such as Moody's maintained Firefly's credit rating at a very high AA level. Therefore, for a whole week, Eric was surrounded by executives from Morgan Stanley, Bear Stearns, Merrill Lynch, and investment banks from all over the world. After all, it involved the issuance of $8 billion of bonds. If the investment banks got the deal, the basic commission and the interest margin earned during the issuance process were enough for them to earn hundreds of millions of dollars in profit. In the 1990s, most investment banks in the United States only made about $1 billion in annual profits. In order to raise this huge amount of funds as soon as possible, Eric followed Chris's original advice and chose the two lead underwriters, Morgan Stanley and Deutsche Bank, to undertake the issuance of $4 billion of bonds respectively. At the same time, he raised funds in North America and Europe. He was really busy in New York for a week. Because he was surrounded by a large number of media at all times, Eric didn't even have a chance to go to Long Island to visit his son and daughter, who were about to turn 1, let alone have a chance to investigate Catherine, who was also in New York. On March 21st, although there were still a lot of things to do in New York, Eric had to take a plane back to Los Angeles to attend the 66th Academy Awards. The small Gulfstream business jet owned by Firefly Company landed at Santa Monica Airport. Feeling someone patting his shoulder, Eric opened his eyes. Seeing the tall stewardess in front of him, Eric nodded slightly and stood up. During the week in New York, Eric couldn't rest until late at night. The only thing he wanted now was to have a good sleep. He walked off the plane alone with a suitcase and looked at his watch. It was already 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Feeling the warm sunlight above his head, Eric realized that the time on his watch was U.S. Eastern Time. At this time, it should be 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Los Angeles. There were only 5 hours left until the Academy Awards began. As one of the most important film award ceremonies in the United States and even the world, the stars participating in the Oscars were usually ready within a few days of the ceremony. Eric thought that it was rare to see a situation like his. He had only received a script from the Academy Awards committee 3 days ago. However, because he was discussing the details of the bond issue with the acquisition team, Eric only took a few glances at it. Now he had basically forgotten about it in his mind. However, it was a good thing that he was going to present the Best Film Award at the end. As the awards ceremony was nearing its end, there wouldn't be too many restrictions on the guests' lines. Eric believed that no one at the Academy would hold him accountable if he just casually expressed himself. The person who came to pick him up was Kapoor. Although Eric's status was far beyond the level of a director, matters such as attending events would still be arranged by ICM. The two of them chatted and laughed as they got into a business car. Kapoor then joked to Eric, "Only you can be so careless about the Oscars. Some stars in the company can't even sleep for a few days when they hear that you're attending." Eric smiled and gestured to Kapoor to show his faint dark circles. He smiled and said, "I can't even guarantee that I won't fall asleep at the Oscars." "Oh right, the seat they arranged for me won't be in the first row, right?" Kapoor said. "What do you think? Who would dare to arrange for you to sit in a corner now?" "Okay." Eric shrugged. "If I sleep at the Oscars, it will probably increase the ratings for the ceremony." Kapoor laughed. After a while he said, "Oh right, have you been paying attention to the recent Hollywood news?" Eric shook his head and said, "No, what happened?" "Last week, Michael Ovitz sold his shares in CAA. This morning, Japan's Panasonic Group announced the appointment of Michael Ovitz as the president of Global Pictures. Michael Eisner will be undergoing heart surgery soon." Kapoor paused and said, "Michael Eisner's heart problem is very serious. I heard that the success rate of the quadruple bypass surgery this time is only about 75%. Eric and Kapoor did not have much friendship with Michael Eisner. Moreover, Eric was very clear about the results of Michael Eisner's heart surgery this time. Therefore, he did not think much of it. He only asked, "Did Panasonic not ask Michael Eisner to resign?" Global's business situation has been improving for the past 2 years. As long as Michael Eisner successfully completes the heart surgery, he will be able to resume his previous work. The Japanese are also waiting for the results. I think Global will definitely be in trouble in the future." Eric smiled and said, "Although Michael Ovitz has managed CAA very well, a film company is not a management company. If Michael Eisner does not survive this surgery, then it will not be easy for Michael Ovitz to maintain the situation at Global. If Michael Eisner can successfully complete the surgery, then the situation will be even more interesting. Kapoor saw that Eric had a gloating smile on his face and asked, "What do you mean?" Although Michael Eisner and Michael Ovitz are very good friends, this is only under the circumstance that it does not involve the power struggle of the company. Both of them are very controlling people. Once Michael Eisner successfully completes the surgery, then Global Pictures is likely to fall into an internal power struggle. Eric suddenly asked, "By the way, did Michael Eisner prepare a golden parachute employment agreement for Michael Ovitz?" In his memory, Michael Ovitz worked at Disney for more than a year and left with more than $100 million in compensation. This was because Michael Eisner had prepared a golden parachute for Michael Ovitz with a very high compensation amount. It seems so. Otherwise, Michael Ovitz would not have given up CAA so easily and joined Global Pictures. 5 years ago, when Sony had just acquired Columbia, they had also invited Michael Ovitz to take over the company. At that time, Michael Ovitz immediately rejected the offer. That's it. Eric smiled and nodded. Let's wait for a good show. In the future, Global will definitely be very lively. Kapoor nodded as well, but his expression was a little strange. Eric noticed Kapoor's expression and asked with a smile, "Don't tell me you want to become a film company's executive like Michael Ovitz?" Kapoor nodded slightly and did not deny it. Eric knew very well that most of the executives of agencies wanted to become a film company's executive. This not only meant a higher salary, but also more power. However, although there were many cases in the history of Hollywood where agents turned into executives of film companies and producers, there were not many who were very successful. In the memory of Eric's previous life, only Langmuir, who successfully took charge of Universal Pictures, could be regarded as the head of a major film company. From the bottom of his heart, Eric did not recommend Kapoor to change careers. However, in the face of Kapoor's thoughts, Eric did not know how to persuade him. It seemed that he could only let the facts speak for themselves. Let's talk about tonight's Oscars. I haven't been paying much attention. Which awards are more likely for Pulp Fiction? There are no big-name directors competing this year. I think Quentin is very likely to win Best Director. Kapoor also put aside the matter just now and said, "However, the most stable award should be Best Original Screenplay." Eric remembered that in his previous life, the best actor this year should have been Tom Hanks. However, because Hanks filmed Saving Private Ryan in advance, the male lead of Philadelphia Story was changed. Eric did not see the Best Actor nomination for Philadelphia Story at the Golden Globe Awards. However, thinking of another person, Eric shook his head and said, "Then John Travolta's Best Actor should also be out of the picture, right?" Kapoor nodded. Daniel Day-Lewis lost to Al Pacino for Best Actor in My Left Foot a few years ago. This year, he was nominated for a second time. His chances of winning are much higher than John Travolta's. Although Pulp Fiction shocked the critics and film fans, there were no strong competitors this year. However, Eric eventually discovered that due to the limitations of the subject matter, the chances of this film winning an important award such as Best Film were still very low. The subsequent facts also proved this point. Chapter 598. There were originally 2 films that Firefly used to compete for the Oscars this year: Interview with the Vampire and Pulp Novel. However, after the Oscar nominations were released, Eric discovered that although Night Interview with the Vampire had good industry reviews, and Firefly had made a lot of money at the box office, vampire movies and comedies were not liked by the Oscar judges. Firefly had done a lot of work for the Oscar public relations for this movie, but in the end, they only received insignificant nominations such as Best Makeup and Best Sound Effects. In the end, the heavy responsibility of Firefly's Oscars fell on Pulp Novel. Although Eric joked with Kapoor that he was likely to fall asleep during the award ceremony, the Oscars were often ridiculed for being too long. However, except for those guests who were old and tired, most people found it difficult to feel sleepy in the tense and hot atmosphere of the Oscars ceremony. Needless to say, It was quite interesting to watch this awards ceremony that was very different from the original Time and Space. The original Schindler's List was brought forward by a year. In addition to pulp novel, there were also several popular nominees this year, such as In the Name of the Father, A Piano Lover, Intersection of Lives, and so on. Moreover, Eric was surprised to find that there were 2 Chinese films nominated for Best Foreign Language Film this year. One was called The Wedding Banquet, and the other was called Farewell My Concubine. However, the Best Foreign Language Film award ultimately fell to Penelope's Beautiful Age. In addition, Eric also noticed Jane Campion, who was nominated for Best Director for A Piano Lover. This female director from Australia stopped at 1 nomination. Although he didn't know in detail, Eric also knew that there were very few women nominated for Best Director in the history of the Oscars. There shouldn't be any in the past decade. This would be a huge variable for next year's Oscar for Best Director. If Catherine was nominated for Best Director again as a woman for Saving Private Ryan, then the Oscar judges might have to consider the ethical risks of ignoring a female director for 2 consecutive years. After failing to win Best Actor, Best Supporting Actor, and Best Supporting Actress consecutively, Quentin lost to Robert Altman of Intersection of Lives in the competition for Best Director. Robert Altman, who was good at shooting satirical films, had been nominated for Best Director 3 times before this. Although he lost to Steven Spielberg in the original Spacetime, this time, no one could guide this veteran director to an Oscar. When Robert Altman and the guest presenter, Clint Eastwood, left the stage, Eric, who was standing backstage, had a hunch that Pulp Fiction might only win the Best Original Screenplay award this year. However, Eric did not care about this. As long as Pulp Fiction got enough box office sales, everything would be fine. Hearing the announcer call out his name, Eric walked to the stage with the envelope containing the Best Picture results. As soon as he appeared, there was a very warm applause from the audience. Eric walked to Mike with a smile. He thought the applause would stop, but the applause did not show any signs of stopping. Instead, it became more and more enthusiastic. The Oscars was actually a party for everyone to support each other. As the host joked at an award ceremony, a group of millionaires gave out awards to each other. Eric's reputation and power in Hollywood had been growing in recent years, so it was not too surprising that he received such treatment. The applause lasted for half a minute before Eric pressed his hands together, glanced at the audience, and said with a smile, "Actually, when I received the invitation to be a guest presenter, I was very scared." Although there wasn't any obvious humor in this sentence, the audience still chuckled very cooperatively. I've always thought that such an important award should only be presented by someone who is at least 60 years old. However, the director immediately refuted me and said that I've already done everything that other people can only do when they're 80 years old. So I came up here. With the laughter from the audience, Eric said in a serious tone, "But don't expect anything. Even if this award is given by me, the Oscar will definitely not be pure gold." The audience knew that this was Eric teasing his personal wealth, so there was another burst of laughter. Eric cleared his throat and said, "Of course, Best Picture represents an honor. It is the affirmation of the value of a film by more than 6,000 professional judges. This is definitely not something that can be replaced by money. So, let's take a look at the outstanding nominees this year." Eric gestured to the screen and walked to the side. Clips of the 5 nominated films, Pulp Fiction, Intersection of Lives, Piano Lover, In the Name of the Father, and Farewell to the Sentient Sky, appeared on the screen one by one. Eric looked at the clips of these films and was not sure who would win Best Picture this year. Compared to the relatively small number of judges for Best Director and Best Actor, Best Picture was unanimously selected by more than 6,000 judges from various judges' associations. This meant that the Best Picture award could be reflected to a certain extent in the previous Best Director, Best Actor, and Best Actress awards. If a film won more important awards, then it could be said that the Best Picture award was locked in. However, this year was a complete Oscar year. Not a single film was the big winner that everyone expected. Best Director went to Robert Altman of Intersection of Lives. Best Actor went to Daniel Day-Lewis of In the Name of the Father. Best Actress went to Holly Hunter of A Piano Lover. while Best Original Screenplay went to Pulp Fiction. The Best Supporting Actor and Actress also belonged to different films. The judges, who had the largest number of people, made completely different choices. It looked like the outcome of the best film would depend on the strength of the public relations. Although he did not know who would win, Eric was sure that after this year's Oscars, the media's comments would definitely be much more lively than before. After the introductions of the 5 films were over, Eric walked up to Mike again. He opened the envelope in his hand and glanced at the audience. His eyes quickly found a crew, and then he could not help but squint because he saw 2 familiar people around the crew. Elizabeth, who was wearing a white dress, and a fat man named Wayne Stan. Because of Eric's brief hesitation, everyone in the Los Angeles Music Hall followed Eric's gaze. Some people even whispered softly. Eric quickly came back to his senses and said, "Then the 1993 Best Picture Oscar goes to Jane Chapman of Piano Lover." Following the applause, a short-haired woman in her 40s stood up from the crew of Piano Lover. She hugged everyone, and then walked to the stage excitedly. "Congratulations, Miss Chapman." Eric handed the golden statuette to her, politely hugged her, and then stepped aside. While Jane Chapman was giving her acceptance speech, Eric, who was standing next to her, looked down the stage again. In this era, the Best Picture Oscar crew did not rush to the stage like later years. The crew of Piano Lover was still sitting in the same place. Noticing Eric's gaze, Harvey Weinstein nodded politely to him. Elizabeth raised her chin a little proudly and drew the letter C in front of her with her finger. Then she clenched her fist and suddenly opened it, making a gesture of destruction. Even if Elizabeth didn't give him these hints, Eric could guess what she was trying to do. Jane Campbell's identity as a woman was both an advantage and a disadvantage. If it were not for Robert Altman, who had accumulated several Oscar nominations, Weinstein's ability to manipulate public opinion and award PR, coupled with the huge media support of News Corporation, perhaps Jane Campbell could really become the first female director to win the Best Director Oscar. But because of Robert Altman, Weinstein knew that the chances of winning the Best Director Oscar were slim. So he turned to the Best Picture Oscar and successfully promoted a female producer. This was obviously to pave the way for Braveheart next year. In this way, if Catherine was nominated for Best Director for Saving Private Ryan next year, and did not win the award, the Academy would have enough reason to say that. Since they had awarded such an important award to a woman this year, the media would have no reason to accuse them of sexism. Since he had decided to support Elizabeth in his heart, and had deliberately pushed Fox to acquire Mira Mike, Eric certainly would not be angry at the girl's little scheme. Anyway, regardless of whether Braveheart or Saving Private Ryan would be the big winner next year, in Eric's view, it was just a matter of left and right hand. Otherwise, Eric would not have delayed the production of Forrest Private Ryan by a year. What's more, compared to Saving Private Ryan, Braveheart obviously needed more awards to recover more profits. Eric had planned to go back and rest immediately after the award ceremony, but when he thought of Tom Hanks, who was also attending the award ceremony for Forrest Private Ryan, he decided to talk to Hanks about it first. He left the Los Angeles Music Center with the crowd, and went to the Vanity Fair Oscar banquet at the Hilton Hotel. Although Eric had changed the history of Hollywood, the Vanity Fair party still happened on time. It was just that Eric had not been able to attend in the past few years. In the lively party hall, Eric and Hanks went to a quiet corner together, and briefly introduced the plot of Forrest Private Ryan to Hanks. Hanks listened attentively to Eric's analysis of the plot, nodded, and said, "Eric, since it's the script you like, of course there's no problem. I'll ask my agent to turn down those invitations tomorrow." "Well, this story sounds very interesting. Maybe I should read the original." Eric quickly shook his head and said, "The original story is a somewhat absurd satirical novel. I don't recommend you read it before you see the script, because I intend to adapt it into an inspirational film that shows the history of the United States from the 50s to the 70s. The protagonist Forrest Private Ryan represents a simple and sincere attitude towards life. If you read the original in advance, it may have a bad impact on your character. People's first impressions are very biased." "Well, when will the film start production? Just let me know." Hanks nodded with a smile and agreed. As for the salary and other things, of course, he didn't need to negotiate with Eric personally. These things were usually left to the producer and Hank's agent to negotiate. The two chatted casually for a while, and then separated. Eric greeted some acquaintances, and casually dealt with a few guests who came up to talk to him. When he saw the figures of Penelope and Kate, he planned to secretly leave the party with the two women in advance. However, just as he was about to walk towards the two women, Elizabeth led a group of people from the piano lover crew over. "Eric, this is Ms. Jane Campion and Ms. Jane Chapman." Eric smiled and shook hands with them one by one. Everyone knew the relationship between Elizabeth and Eric.